A Morbid Taste for Bones by Ellis Peters. On the fine bright morning in early May, when the whole sensational affair of the Gwytherin relics may properly be considered to have begun, Brother Cadfael had been up long before prime, pricking out cabbage seedlings before the day was aired, and his thoughts were all on birth, growth, and fertility, not at all on graves and reliquaries and violent deaths, whether of saints, sinners, or ordinary, decent, fallible men like himself. Nothing troubled his peace but the necessity to take himself indoors for Mass, and the succeeding half-hour of chapter, which was always liable to stray over by an extra 10 minutes. He grudged the time from his more congenial labours, out here among the vegetables, but there was no evading his duty. He had, after all, chosen this cloistered life with his eyes open. He could not complain even of those parts of it he found unattractive, when the whole suited him very well, and gave him the kind of satisfaction he felt now, as he straightened his back and looked about him. He doubted if there was a finer Benedictine garden in the whole kingdom, or one better supplied with herbs, both good for spicing meats and also invaluable as medicine. The main orchards and lands of the Shrewsbury Abbey of St. Peter and St. Paul lay on the northern side of the road, outside the monastic enclave. But here, in the enclosed garden within the walls, close to the abbot's fish ponds and the brook that worked the abbey mill, Brother Cadfael ruled unchallenged. The herbarium in particular was his kingdom, for he had built it up gradually through 15 years of labour, and had added to it many exotic plants of his own careful raising, collected in a roving youth that had taken him as far afield as Venice and Cyprus and the Holy Land. For Brother Cadfael had come late to the monastic life, like a battered ship settling at last for a quiet harbour. He was well aware that in the first years of his vows the novices and lay servants had been wont to point him out to one another with awed whisperings. "See that brother working in the garden there? The thick-set fellow who rolls from one leg to the other like a sailor. You wouldn't think to look at him, would you, that he went on crusade when he was young? He was with Godfrey de Bouillon at Antioch, when the Saracens surrendered it. And he took to the seas as a captain when the King of Jerusalem ruled all the coast of the Holy Land, and served against the Corsairs 10 years. Hard to believe it now, eh?" Brother Cadfael himself found nothing strange in his wide-ranging career, and had forgotten nothing and regretted nothing. He saw no contradiction in the delight he had taken in battle and adventure, and the keen pleasure he now found in quietude, spiced, to be truthful, with more than a little mischief when he could get it, as he liked his victuals well-flavoured, but quietude all the same, a ship becalmed and enjoying it. 5 minutes more, and he must go and wash his hands and prepare to the church for Mass. He used the respite to walk the length of his pale-flowered, fragrant inner kingdom, where Brother John and Brother Columbanus, 2 youngsters barely a year tonsured, were busy weeding and edge-trimming. The 2 young men, with habits kilted to the knee, were just straightening their backs and dusting the soil from their hands, as well aware as he of the hour. Brother Columbanus would not for the world have let slip 1 grain of his duties, or countenance such a backsliding in any of his fellows. A very comely, well-made, upstanding young fellow he was, with a round, formidable Norman head, as he came from a formidable aristocratic Norman family, a younger son dispatched to make his way in the monastic ranks as next best to inheriting land. Brother John was as plain and as practical as his name, a square young man with a snub nose and an untamable ring of wiry, russet curls around his tonsure. He was a handsome, lusty, good-natured soul, who seemed to have blundered into this enclosed life by some incomprehensible error, and not yet to have realized that he had come to the wrong place. The third Mass of the day was non-parochial and brief, and after it the Benedictine brothers of the Abbey of Shrewsbury filed in procession from the choir into the chapter-house, and made their way to their stalls in due order, Abbot Heribert leading. The abbot was old, of mild nature and pliant. Novices and pupils were easy in his presence, when they could reach it, which was by no means always easy, for the extremely impressive figure of Prior Robert was liable to loom between. Prior Robert Pennant, of mixed Welsh and English blood, was more than 6 feet tall, attenuated and graceful, silver-grey of hair at 50, blanched and beautiful of visage, with long aristocratic features and lofty marble brow. There was no man in the Midland Shires would look more splendid in a mitre, superhuman in height and authority, and there was no man in England better aware of it, or more determined to prove it at the earliest opportunity. His very motions, sweeping across the chapter house to his stall, understudied the pontificate. After him came Brother Richard, the sub-prior, his antithesis, large, ungainly, amiable and benevolent, of a good mind but mentally lazy. Doubtful if he would ever become prior when Robert achieved his end, with so many ambitious and industrious younger men eyeing the prospect of advancement, and willing to go to a great deal of trouble to secure it. After Richard came all the other brothers in their hierarchies. Brother Benedict, the sacristan, Brother Anselm, the precentor, Brother Matthew, the cellarer, Brother Dennis, the hospitaller, Brother Edmund, the infirmary, Brother Oswald, the almoner, Brother Jerome, the prior's clerk, and Brother Paul, master of the novices, followed by the commonalty of the convent, and a very flourishing number they made. Among the last of them, Brother Cadfael rolled to his own chosen corner, well to the rear and poorly lit, half concealed behind one of the stone pillars. Since he held no troublesome parchment office, he was unlikely to be called upon to speak in chapter upon the various businesses of the house, and when the matter in hand was dull into the bargain, it was his habit to employ the time to good account by sleeping, which from long usage he could do bolt upright and undetected in his shadowy corner. On this particular May morning he composed himself to slumber. After all, he knew that most of the remaining time, once a couple of minor malefactors had been dealt with, would be given to Prior Robert's campaign to secure the relics and patronage of a powerful saint for the monastery. For the past few months very little else had been discussed. The prior had had it on his mind, in fact, ever since the Cluniac house of Wenlock had rediscovered, with great pride and jubilation, the tomb of their original foundress, St. Milburga, and installed her bones triumphantly on their altar. An alien priory, only a few miles distant, with its own miracle-working saint, and the great Benedictine house of Shrewsbury as empty of relics as a plundered alms-box. It was more than Prior Robert could stomach. He had been scouring the borderlands for a spare saint now for a year or more, looking hopefully towards Wales, where it was well known that holy men and women had been common as mushrooms in autumn, in the past, and as little regarded. Brother Cadfael had no wish to hear the latest of his complaints and urgings. He slept. The sound that brought him leaping wide awake out of his dream was loud enough to waken the dead. The shriek was just subsiding into a series of rending moans and broken cries that might have been of extreme pain or extreme ecstasy. In the open space in the centre of the chapter house, Brother Columbanus lay on his face, threshing and jerking like a landed fish, beating his forehead and his palms against the flagstones, kicking and flailing with long pale legs bared to the knees by his contortions, and barking out of him those extraordinary sounds of shattering physical excitement, while the nearest of the brothers hovered in helpless shock, and Prior Robert, with lifted hands, exhorted and exclaimed. Brother Cadfael and Brother Edmund, the infirmary, reached the victim together, kneeled over him, one on either side, and restrained him from battering his brains out against the stones of the floor, or dislocating his joints in his flailings. "A falling sickness," said Brother Edmund tersely, and wedged the thick cord of Columbanus's girdle between his teeth, and a fold of his habit with it, to prevent him from biting his tongue. Brother Cadfael was less certain of the diagnosis, for these were not the gruntings, helpless noises of an epileptic in an attack, but such as might be expected from a hysterical woman in a frenzy. But at least the treatment stopped half the noise, and even appeared to diminish the vigour of the convulsions, though they resumed again as soon as the restraining grip on him was loosed. "Poor young man," fluttered Abbot Herbert, hovering in the background. "So sudden, so cruel an affliction. Handle him gently. Carry him to the infirmary. We must pray for his restoration." Chapter broke up in some disorder. With the help of Brother John, and certain others of a practical turn of mind, they got Brother Columbanus securely but comfortably swathed in a sheet. When they had managed to get a draught of Brother Cadfael's poppy juice into him, his moans subsided into pitiful mutterings, and the violence of his struggles against his confinement grew feebler. "Take good care of him," said Prior Robert, frowning anxiously over the young man's bed. "Brother Jerome, I put this sufferer in your charge, and excuse you from all other duties while he needs you." "Willingly," said Brother Jerome, "and prayerfully." He was Prior Robert's closest associate, and most devoted hanger-on, and an inevitable choice whenever Robert required strict obedience and meticulous reporting, as might well be the case where a brother of the house succumbed to what might elsewhere be whispered abroad as a fit of madness. Brother Jerome appeared at chapter next morning with an exalted countenance and the air of one bursting with momentous news. "Father, I have left Brother Columbanus sleeping, though not peacefully, for even his sleep is tormented." "Our brother is no better?" asked the abbot anxiously. "He is still deeply troubled, and when he wakes, he raves. But, Father, there is sure hope for him. In the night, I have been miraculously visited. I have come to tell you what divine mercy has instructed me. Father, in the small hours, I fell into a doze beside Brother Columbanus's bed, and had a marvellously sweet dream." By this time, he had everyone's attention. Even Brother Cadfael was wide awake. "What, another of them?" whispered Brother John wickedly into his ear. "The plague is spreading." "Father, it seemed to me that the wall of the room opened, and a great light shone in, and through the light and radiating the light, there came in a most beautiful young virgin, and stood beside our brother's bed, and spoke to me. She told me that her name was Winifred, and that in Wales there is a holy spring that rose to the light where she suffered martyrdom. And she said that if Brother Columbanus bathed in the water of that well, he would surely be healed and restored at once to his senses. Then she uttered a blessing upon our house and vanished in a great light, and I awoke." Through the murmur of excitement that went round the chapter house, Prior Robert's voice rose in reverent triumph. "Father Abbot, we are being guided. Our quest for a saint has drawn to us this sign of favour, in token that we should persevere." "Winifred?" said the abbot doubtfully. "I do not recall clearly the story of this saint and martyr. There are so many of them in Wales. Certainly we ought to send Brother Columbanus to her holy spring. It would be ingratitude to neglect so clear an omen. But exactly where is it to be found?" Prior Robert looked around for the few Welshmen among the brothers, passed somewhat hurriedly over Brother Cadfael, who had never been one of his favourites, perhaps by reason of a certain spark in his eye, as well as his notoriously worldly past, and lit gladly upon old Brother Rees, who was virtually senile, but doctrinally safe, and had the capacious, if capricious, memory of the very old. "Brother, can you tell us the history of this saint, and where her well is to be found?" "Saint Winifred," declaimed the old man, beginning to enjoy his hour of glory, "was the only child of a knight named Tevith, who lived in those parts when the princes were yet heathens. But this knight and all his household were converted by Saint Bueno, and made him a church there, and gave him house-room. The girl was devoted even above her parents, and pledged herself to a virgin life, hearing Mass every day. But one Sunday it happened that she was sick, and stayed at home when all the rest of the household went to church. And there came to the door the prince of those parts, Rhyddderch, a son of the king, who had fallen in love with her at a distance. For this girl was very, very beautiful. Very beautiful, gloated Brother Rees, and licked his lips loudly. Prior Robert visibly recoiled, but refrained from stopping the flow by reproof. "He pleaded that he was hot and parched from hunting," said Brother Rees darkly, "and asked for a drink of water, and the girl let him in, and gave him a drink. Then," he shrilled, hunching himself in his voluminous habit and springing erect with a vigour nobody present would have credited, "he pressed his suit upon her, and grappled in his arms, thus." The effort was almost too much for him, and moreover the prior was eyeing him in alarm. He subsided with dignity. "The faithful virgin put him off with soft words, and escaping into another room, climbed from a window and fled towards the church. But finding that she had eluded him, Prince Caradoc took horse and rode after, and overtaking her just within sight of the church, and dreading that she would reveal his infamy, struck off her head with his sword." He paused for the murmur or horror, pity, and indignation, and got it, with a flurry of prayerfully folded hands and a tribute of round eyes. "Then thus piteously she came by her death and beatitude?" intoned Brother Jerome enthusiastically. "Not a bit of it," snapped Brother Rees. He had never liked Brother Jerome. "Saint Bueno and the congregation were coming out of the church and saw what had passed. The saint drew a terrible curse upon the murderer, who at once sank to the ground and began to melt like wax in a fire, until all his body had sunk away into the grass. Then Saint Bueno fitted the head of the Virgin onto her neck, and the flesh grew together, and she stood up alive, and the holy fountain sprang up on the spot where she arose." They waited spellbound, and he let them wait. He had lost interest after her death. "And afterwards?" insinuated Prior Robert. "What did the saint do with her restored life?" "She went on a pilgrimage to Rome," said Brother Rees indifferently, "and she attended a great synod of saints, and was appointed to be prioress over a community of virgin sisters at Gwynedd by Llanrwst, and there she lived many years and did many miracles in her lifetime, if it should be called her lifetime. Well, she was once dead already. When she died a second time, that was where it befell." He felt nothing concerning this residue of life. He offered it with a shrug. The girl had had her chance with Prince Caradoc, and let it slip. Obviously her natural bent was to be prioress of a nest of virgins, and there was nothing more to be told about her. "And she is buried there at Gwynedd?" persisted the prior. "And her miracles continued after death?" "So I have heard, but it's a long time," said the old man, "since I've heard her name mentioned, and longer since I was in those parts." Prior Robert stood in the circle of sunlight that filtered between the pillars of the chapter house, drawn to his full imposing height, and turned a radiant face and commanding eyes upon Abbot Heribert. "Father, does it not seem to you that our reverent search for a patron of great power and sanctity is being divinely guided?" "It certainly seems that she has shown us a singular favour," admitted Abbot Heribert. "Father, have I your leave to send Brother Columbanus with a safe escort to Holywell this very day?" "Do so," said the abbot, "with the prayers of us all, and may he return as St. Winifred's own messenger, hale and grateful." The delegation to Holywell was gone 5 days, and came home towards evening in a fine shower of rain and a grand glow of grace, chanting prayers as the three entered the courtyard. In the midst rode Columbanus. His face was bright and clear, his eyes full of wonder and intelligence. No man ever looked less mad or less likely to be subject to the falling sickness. "Father," said Brother Columbanus, eager and joyous, "I owe my recovery to the intervention of St. Winifred, and I praise and worship her from my heart, as I do God who caused her to take pity on me." The abbot listened solemnly. "And, Father, the people there told us that the saint is indeed buried at Gwynedd, where she died after her ministry, and that the place where her body is laid has done many miracles. But they say that her tomb, after so long, is neglected and little thought of, and it may well be that she longs for a better recognition, and to be installed in some place where pilgrims may come, where she may be revered as is her due, and have room to enlarge her grace and blessing to reach more people in need. "You are inspired, having been present at this miracle," said Prior Robert, tall and splendid with faith rewarded. "And you speak out what I have felt in listening to you. Father Abbot, give me your leave to petition the Church, and bring this blessed lady home to rest here among us, and be our proudest boast, for I believe it is her will and her command." "In the name of God," said Abbot Herbert devoutly, "I approve that project, and pray the blessing of heaven upon it." "He had it all planned beforehand," said Brother John over the bed of mint. "That was all a show, all that wonder and amazement, and asking who St. Winifred was and where to find her. He knew it all along. He'd already picked her out of those he'd discovered neglected in Wales, most likely. It's as plain as the nose on your face." "And, are you saying," asked Brother Cadfael mildly, "that Brother Columbanus is in the plot as well as Brother Jerome? And that falling fit of his was a fake, too?" Brother John considered seriously, frowning. No, that I don't say. We all know our meek white lamb is liable to the horrors, and pouring ice-cold water over him at Holywell would be the very treatment to jolt him back into his right wits. You notice it was Jerome who was set to take care of him overnight. It takes only one man to be favored with a vision, but it has to be the right man. After dinner, in the somnolent half-hour of sleep for the elders and play for the novices, Cadfael sought out Abbot Herbert in his study. "Father Abbot, it is on my mind that we are undertaking this pilgrimage to Gwynedd without full consideration. It is essential to have a speaker fluent in Welsh there, since every parish priest in Wales has that tongue, and it is vital to be able to speak freely with the priest at Gwynedd, should the bishop sanction our quest." "That is very true," said Abbot Herbert. "Brother Cadfael, Welsh is your first best language. Could you, the garden, I am aware—" "In the garden," said Brother Cadfael, "everything is well forward, and can manage without me 10 days or more, and take no hurt. I should be very glad indeed to be the interpreter, and lend my skills also in Gwynedd." "Then so be it," sighed the abbot in heartfelt relief. "Go with Prior Robert, and be our voice to the Welsh people. I shall sanction your errand myself, and you will have my authority." He was old and human and gentle, full of experience, short on ambition, self-righteousness, and resolution. There could have been 2 ways of approaching him concerning Brother John. Cadfael took the more honest and simple way. "Father, there is a young brother concerning whose vocation I have doubts, but concerning whose goodness I have none. He is very close to me, and I would that he might find his true way, for if he finds it, he will not forsake it. But it may not be with us. I beg that I may take him with me, as our hewer of wood and drawer of water in this enterprise, to allow him time to consider." Abbot Herbert looked faintly dismayed and apprehensive, but not unsympathetic. "I should be very sorry," he said, "to refuse a choice to any man who may be better fitted to serve God elsewhere. Oh, very well. Tell me this young brother's name, and you shall have him." They set out as soon as the fine reliquary for the saint's bones was ready, polished oak ornamented with silver and lined with lead, to serve as a proof that honours awaited Winifred in her new shrine. In the 3rd week of May, they came to Bangor, and told their story to Bishop David, who was sympathetic, and readily gave his consent to the proposed translation, subject only to the agreement of Prince Owain, who was regent of Gwynedd, owing to the illness of the old king, his father. They ran the prince to earth at Aber, and found him equally obliging, for he not only gave the desired approval, but sent his one English-speaking clerk and chaplain to show them the best and quickest way to Gwynedd, and commend them and their errand to the parish priest there. The chaplain was called Urien. He was a compact, neat, well-shaven personage, handsomely dressed and mounted, more of an ambassador than a clerk. "That is Gwynedd?" asked Prior Robert. "The parish stretches for several miles along the river valley. We do not congregate in villages as you English do. Land good for hunting is plentiful, but good for tillage, meagre. Every man lives where best suits him for working his fields and conserving his game." They were down in the little arena of grass and vegetable plots, clear of trees. The stone church, with its tiny turret and tinier bell visible within, shone blindly white, bluish-white against all the lush green. And out of the cabbage patch, freshly planted, in the lee of the wooden cabin, rose a small, square man in a brown sackcloth gown, hoisted to the knees, thick brown legs sturdy under him, and a thick set of curly brown hair and beard half concealing a brown, broad, wondering face round two large, dark blue eyes. He came out hastily, scrubbing his hands on his skirts. At close quarters, his eyes were larger, bluer, and more astonished than ever, and as timid as the mild eyes of a doe. "A good day to you, Brother Hugh," said Urien, reining in before him. "I've brought you distinguished guests from England, upon important church business, and with the blessing of Prince and Bishop." By the time Urien had ended his greeting, a score of silent, sudden figures had appeared from nowhere, and made a wary and curious half-circle about their pastor. "My poor household is at the Reverend Father's disposal," said Father Hugh, "and whatever powers I have to serve them also. You come fresh from Abba?" "Oh, from Abba, yes," said Urien, "from Prince Owain, and I must rejoin him there tonight. I am only the herald for these Benedictine brothers, who come on a holy errand, and when I have explained their quest you, then I leave them in your hands." He presented them by name, Prior Robert first. "And have no fear when I have left, for Brother Cadfael here is a man of Gwynedd himself, and speaks Welsh as well as you do." It was not every day, or every year, indeed, that Gwynedd had so momentous a visitation. Every soul in the parish would know before evening not only that monks from Shrewsbury were guests at Hugh's house, but also how many they were, what they looked like, what fine horses and handsome mules they had, and most probably what they had come for into the bargain. Father Hugh provided their party with refreshment while he listened to their story. "In my church," said Hugh humbly, "I have never heard that the saints desired honour for themselves, but rather to honour God rightly. So I do not presume to know what St. Winifred's will may be in this matter. That you and your house should desire to honour her rightly, or that is another matter, and very proper. But, this blessed Virgin lived out her miraculously restored life in this place, and no other. And here she died for the second time, and here is buried. And even if my people have neglected her, being human and faulty, yet they always knew that she was here among them, and at a pinch they could rely on her. And for a Welsh saint I think that counts for much. Prince and Bishop, both of whom I reverence as I ought, may not altogether understand how my flock will feel if their holiest girl is to be dug up out of her grave and taken away into England. It may matter little to the crown and the crozier. A saint is a saint, wherever her relics rest. But I tell you plainly, the people of Gwynedd are not going to like it at all." Brother Cadfael translated with a large declamation of the bards. In full spate, he turned his eyes away from the distracting faces to light upon one even more distracting. A beautiful girl with a light oak sheen on her hair was passing the fence, and had been so charmed by what she heard, and the vehemence of its delivery, that for a moment she forgot to keep moving, and stood there at gaze, apple-blossom face radiant and rose-leaf lips laughing. and with the same fascination with which she gazed at Cadfael, Brother John gazed at her. Cadfael observed both, and was dazzled. Then she blushed beautifully and swept away out of sight. Brother John was still gaping long after she had vanished. "It's hardly important, surely," said Prior Robert with ominous mildness. "Your bishop and your prince have made their views plain. The parishioners need not be consulted." That, too, Cadfael interpreted. "Impossible," said Hugh firmly, knowing himself on secure ground. "On such a grave matter affecting the whole parish, nothing can be done without calling together the assembly of the free men and putting the case to them fully and publicly. Doubtless the will of prince and bishop will prevail, but even so, these must be put to the people before they can say yes or no to them. I shall call such an assembly tomorrow. Your case can only be vindicated absolutely by public acceptance." All the free men of Gwynedd came to the meeting next day, and their womenfolk and all the villine community came to the mass beforehand. Father Hugh named the chief among them softly to Brother Cadfael as they made their appearance. He had seldom had such a congregation. "Here is Rhyddderch, with his daughter and his steward, and the girl's waiting woman." Rhyddderch was a big, bluff, hearty-looking man of about 50, high-coloured and dark-haired, with a short, grizzled beard and bold features that could be merry or choleric, fierce or jovial, but were far too expressive ever to be secretive or mean. His stride was long and impetuous, and his smile quick in response when he was greeted. His dress hardly distinguished him from any of the other free landholders who came thronging into the church, being plain as any, but of good homespun cloth. To judge from his bright face, he came without prejudice, willing to listen, and for all his thwarted family plans, he looked an expansively happy man, proud and fond of his daughter. As for the girl, she followed at his heels modestly, with poised head and serene eyes. Her hair was brushed and braided into a burnished dark coil on her neck, and covered with a linen coif, but there was no mistaking her. This was Shoned, the greatest heiress and most desirable prize in marriage in all this countryside. The steward was an older man, grey-haired and balding, with a soft, good-humoured face. "He is Rhyddderch's kinsman by marriage," whispered Hugh, "his wife's elder brother." "And the other girl is Shoned's tirewoman?" Dimpled and smiling, Amnest followed her friend with demure little steps into the church, and the sun stroked all the bright silvery grain in the sheaf of her pale hair. Cadfael noted that Brother John's eyes were on her again, and looking after the shapely waist and glowing hair with fascinated eyes. "Lower your eyes, brother," said Jerome chidingly. "It is not seemly to look so straightly upon women." "And how did he know there were women passing?" whispered Brother John rebelliously, "if his own eyes were so dutifully lowered." Brother Columbanus at least was standing as prescribed in the presence of females, with pale hands prayerfully folded and lofty eyelids lowered, his gaze upon the grass. "And here comes Cadfael now," said Father Hugh. "These good brothers already know him, of course, and his lady, and his son, Peryd." This young man, as Cadfael had learned from Father Hugh the previous night, loping after his parents with the long, springy gait of a yearling roebuck, was the chosen husband for Shoned, the lad she liked well enough, and had known familiarly all her life, but was in no way inclined to marry. It occurred to Cadfael that he had never asked how the groom felt about the situation, but it needed only a glimpse of Peryd's face when he caught sight of Shoned to settle the matter. Here was a tangle. The girl may have worn out in mere liking all her inclination to love, but the boy certainly had not. At sight of her, his face paled, and his eyes took fire. Cadfael wondered who was Shoned's chosen one, if this able young man was not to be. At the right moment, when the church was full, Prior Robert, tall and imposing and carefully groomed, swept in through the tiny sacristy and took his place, and all the Shrewsbury brothers fell into line and followed on his heels. The Mass began. In the deliberations of the Free Assembly of the parish, of course, the women had no part. Neither had the villeins, though they had their indirect influence through those of their friends who were free. So while the free men lingered after the Mass, the rest dispersed, moving away with slow dignity, and not too far, just far enough to be discreetly out of sight and earshot, but handy to detect what was passing by instinct, and confirm it as soon as the meeting broke up. The free men gathered in the open before the church. The sun was already high, for it was little more than an hour to noon. Father Hugh stood up before the assembly and gave them the gist of the matter as it had been presented to him. He was the father of this flock, and he owed his people truth, but he also owed his church fealty. He told them what bishop and prince had answered to the request from Shrewsbury, reverently presented, and with many proofs, which proofs he left to Robert to deliver. The prior had never looked holier or more surely headed for sainthood itself. He had always a sense of occasion, and beyond a doubt it had been his idea to hold the meeting here in the open, where the sun could gild and illuminate his otherworldly beauty. It was Cadfael's detached opinion that he did himself more than justice, by being less overbearing than might have been expected. Usually he overdid things. This time he got it right, or as right as something only equivocally right in itself can be got. "They're not happy," whispered Brother John in Cadfael's ear, himself sounding far from sad about it. There were times when even Brother John could be humanly smug. And, indeed, those Welsh faces ranged round them were singularly lacking in enthusiasm for all those English miracles performed by a Welsh saint. Robert, at his best, was not exactly carrying his audience. They swayed and murmured, and eyed one another, and again turned as one man to eye him. "If Owain ap Griffiths wills it, and the bishop gives his blessing too," began Cadwallon hesitantly, "as loyal sons of the church, and true men of Gwynedd, we can hardly, both prince and bishop, have blessed our errand," said the prior loftily. "But the girl is here, in Gwynedd," said Rhyddderch abruptly. He had the voice that might have been expected from him, large, melodious, and deep, a voice that sang what it felt and waited for thought afterwards, to find that the thought had been there already in the feeling. "Ours, not Bishop David's, not Owain ap Griffith's. She lived out her life here, and never said word about wanting to leave us. Am I to believe easily that she wants to leave us now, after so long? Why has she never told us? Why?" "She has made it clear to us," said the prior, "by many manifestations, as I have told you." "Yeah, but never a word to us," cried Rhyddderch, roused. "Do you call that courtesy? How can we believe that of a virgin who chose to make her home here among us?" They were with him. His assurance had fired their smouldering reluctance. They cried out from a dozen directions at once that St. Winifred belonged to Gwynedd, and to no other place. "Do you deny," thundered Robert, stretching his ascetic length to its loftiest, "the truth of those omens and miracles I have declared to you? The beckoning that has led us here?" No, said Rhyddderch roundly. "I have never doubted you believed, and had experienced these portents. But portents can arise, miracles can be delivered either from angels or devils. If these are from heaven, why have we not been instructed? You have been deceived by devils. Winifred never said word." The thunder was one voice now, demanding and assured, but it was one man who had called it into being. Prior Robert, well aware that a single adversary confronted him, subdued his angry tones, and opted for the wisdom of the dove, and the subtlety of single combat. "Come, Brother Cadfael, say this for me to the Lord Rhyddderch, that it is all too easy for us who have the same devotion at heart to disagree about the means. It is better to speak quietly, man to man, and avoid the defamation of anger. Lord Rhyddderch, I beg you to come apart with me, and let us debate this matter in quietude. and then you shall have liberty to speak out what you will, and having had my say fairly with you, I will say no word further to challenge what you have to impart to your people." "Why, that is fair and generous," said Rhyddderch promptly to this offer. All those bright, sullen, roused eyes followed them through the low doorway of Father Hugh's house, and clung there to wait for them to come forth again. They trusted the voice that had spoken for them hitherto to speak for them still. In the small, wood-scented room, dark after the brightness of the day outside, Prior Robert faced his opponent with a calm and reasonable face. "You have spoken well," he said, "and I commend your faith, and the high value you set on the saint, for so do we value her highly. By St. Winifred's departure, Gwynnedd's loss is great. That we own, and I would wish to make due reparation." "Reparation? To Gwynedd?" repeated Rhyddderch, when this was translated to him. "I do not understand how." "And to you," said Robert softly and matter-of-factly, "if you will withdraw your opposition, for then I feel sure all your fellows will do the same, and sensibly accept what bishop and prince decree." It occurred to Cadfael, as he interpreted this, even before the prior began the slow, significant motion of one long hand into the breast of his habit, that Robert was about to make the most disastrous miscalculation of his life. But Rhyddderch's face remained dubious and aloof, quite without understanding, as the prior drew from his bosom a soft leather bag drawn up with a cord at the neck, and laid it on the table, pushing it gently across until it rested against Rhyddderch's right hand. Its progress over the rough boards gave out a small chinking sound. "It's yours," said Robert, "if you will persuade the parish to agree to give up the saint." Too late he felt the unbelieving coldness in the air, and sensed the terrible error that he had made. Hastily he did his best to recover some of the ground lost. "To be used as you think best for Gwynedd. A great sum—" It was useless. Cadfael let it lie in silence. "Money!" said Rhyddderch in the most extraordinary of tones, at once curious, derisory, and revolted. "Money? You dare offer to buy our saint? To buy me? I was in two minds about you, and about what I ought to do, but now, by God, I know what to think. You had your omens, well, now I have mine." No, wait!" The prior was in such agitation that he actually reached out a hand and caught his opponent by the sleeve. "Do nothing in haste. You have mistaken my meaning, indeed, and if I was wrong even to offer an alms to Gwynedd, I'm sorry for it. But do not call it—" Rhyddderch withdrew himself angrily from the detaining clasp, and cut off the protest curtly, wheeling on Cadfael. "Tell him he need not be afraid. I should be ashamed to tell my people that a prior of Shrewsbury tried to corrupt me with a bribe. I don't deal in that kind of warfare, but where I stand, that they shall know, and you too. I pledge my opposition to the death against any attempt to move her bones, and I urge upon my people the same duty. And now this conference is ended." So he said, and so it was. There could be no possible way of prolonging it. The prior was forced to stand with marble face and quiet hands, while Rhyddderch strode away towards the forest path. "You should have told me what you intended," said Father Hugh, timidly reproachful. "I could have told you it was folly, the worst possible. Rhyddderch is not an impious man, not impious," fluted Brother Jerome, appealing to heaven with uplifted eyes. "Men have been excommunicated for this." "Then men have been excommunicated for no evil at all," said Hugh sturdily. "If he is ever to withdraw his opposition, it must be you, Father Prior, who make the first approach to him, and upon a different footing, not in person first. But if I were to go to him, perhaps with Brother Cadfael here, who is known to be a good Welshman himself, and ask him to forget all that has been said and done, and come with an open mind to begin the discussion over again, I think
he would not refuse.
Far be it from me, said Prior Robert loftily, to pass over any means of saving a soul from perdition.
Hugh resumed hurriedly. I will go to Rhyddderch tonight, and ask him to dine here in my house tomorrow. Then, if we can come to terms between us, another assembly can be called, so that all may know that there is peace.
Very well, said the prior. Do so, and I hope you may succeed.
You may rest and sleep, Father Prior,
said Hugh, having returned from his mission, fronting the tall, pale forehead gallantly with his low, brown one.
Rhyddderch has said that he will come, and he will listen. He was gracious and reasonable, and tomorrow at noon, or soon after, he will be here.
Prior Robert certainly loosed a cautious, suppressed sigh of relief. Brother Cadfael said bluntly, You will have need to be persuasive and sincere. He is sincere. I am in no way convinced that he can be lightly persuaded. He was tired of nursing wounded vanities. He spoke out what was in his mind. Father Prior, you made your mistake with him this morning. You will need a change of heart, his or yours, to undo the damage. Prior Robert made his disposition as soon as Mass was over next morning, and with some care. Only Brother Sub-Prior and I, with Father Hugh and Brother Cadfael as interpreter, will sit at table together. You, Brother John, will make yourself useful to the cooks, and do whatever is needed, and you may also see to Father Hugh's cattle and chickens. And you two, Brother Jerome, Brother Columbanus, I have a special mission for you. Since we are about St. Winifred's business, I would have you go and spend the hours, while we deliberate, in vigil and prayer, imploring her aid to bring the obdurate to reason, and our errand to a successful conclusion. Not in the church here, but in her own chapel, in the old graveyard where she is buried. Take your food and your measures of wine with you, and go there now. If we prevail upon Rhyddderch, as with her aid I trust we may, I will send to release you, but continue your intercessions until I do send for you. Cadfael saw Jerome and Columbanus set out with bread and meat wrapped in napkins in the breasts of their habits, and Columbanus carrying the flask with their ration of wine and a small bottle of spring water for himself. "It is very little to offer," he said meekly, "but I will touch nothing but water until our course has prevailed." "More fool he," said Brother John blithely, "for he may well be swearing off wine." It was a fine spring morning, but capricious as May can be. Prior Robert and his attendants sat in the orchard until they were driven indoors by a sharp and sparkling shower that lasted almost half an hour. It was then approaching noon, the time when Rhyddderch would join them. He would have a wet walk by the short path through the forest, or perhaps he had waited for the sun's return at Cadwatlin's house, which was on his way. Making allowance for that, they thought little of it when another half-hour passed, and he did not put in an appearance. But when he was an hour late for the meeting, and still no sign of him, Prior Robert's face grew both grim and cautiously triumphant. "He has heard the warning I issued against his sin, and he fears to come and face me," he said. "He had heard the warning indeed, yes," said Father Hugh heavily, "but I saw no signs of fear in him. He spoke very firmly and calmly, and he is a man of his word. I don't understand this. It is not like him." "We will eat but frugally," said the prior, "and give him every chance of keeping his promise, if something has happened to delay him. So it may be to any man. We will wait until it is time to prepare for vespers." "I'll walk as far as Cadwatlin's house," offered Brother Richard, "for the way is all one to that point, and see if I can meet with him, or get word if he's on his way." He was gone more than an hour and a half, and came back alone. "I went beyond some way along the ride, but saw no sign of him. On my way back I asked at Cadwatlin's gate, but no one had seen him pass. I feared he might have walked by the short path while I was taking the other road." "We'll wait for him until vespers, but no longer," said the prior. By then his voice was growing grimly confident. And now he did not expect the guest to come, and the enemy would have put himself in the wrong to Prior Robert's great gain. Until Vespers, therefore, they waited, 5 hours after the appointed time. The people of Gwynedd could hardly say Rhydderch had been written off too hastily. "So it ends," said the prior, rising and shaking out his skirts like one shaking off a doubt or an incubus. "He has turned tail, and his opposition will carry no weight now with any man. Come, let us go." The sunlight was still bright, but slanting over the green bowl where the church stood, and a number of people were gathering for the service. And out of the deeper green shadows, where the forest path began, came, not Rhydderch, but his daughter, sailing gallantly out into the sunlight in a green gown, with her wild hair tamed and braided, and a linen coif over it, shonned in her church-going person, with Peryd on her heels, his hand possessively cupping her elbow, though she paid little heed to that attention. She saw them issuing in a silent procession from Hugh's gate, and her eyes went from person to person, lingering on Cadfael, who came last, and again looking back with a small frown, as though one face was missing from the expected company. "Where is my father?" she asked, her wide eyes surprised but not yet troubled. "Is he not still here with you? Have I missed him? I rode as far as Cadwallan's house, and he was on foot, so if he has left more than an hour ago, he may well be home by now. I came to bear him company to church, and to go back with him afterwards." Prior Robert looked down at her in some wonder, the first flickering uneasiness twitching his nostrils. "What is she saying? Do you tell me that the Lord Rhydderch set out to come to our meeting?" "Of course," said Shonned, amazed. "He had said that he would." "But he did not come," said Robert. "We've waited for him since noon, and we've seen no sign of him. Brother Sub-Prior went a part of the way to see if he could meet with him, but in vain. He has not been here." She caught the meaning of that without Cadfael's services. Her eyes flashed from face to face, distrustful and ready for anger. "Are you telling the truth? Or have you hidden him away under lock and key until you can get Winifred out of her grave and away to Shrewsbury, He was all that stood in your way, and you have threatened him." Peryd closed his fingers anxiously on her arm and drew her against his side. "Shh! You must not say such things. These brothers would not lie to you." "At what hour," asked Cadfael, "did your father set out this morning?" She looked at him and was a little reassured. The ring of silent onlookers drew nearer, listening attentively, ready to take her part if she needed an army. "A good hour before noon. He was going first to the fields in the clearing, so he would be coming here by the shortest way, cutting through 1/4 of a mile of forest to the usual path. He had plenty of time to be here before noon. As far as the clearing, Engelard would be with him. He was going beyond, to the byres over the hill. There are 2 cows there ready to drop their calves." "We are telling you truly, child," said Father Hugh, his voice as grave and anxious as her own. "We waited for him, and he never came." "Well, what can have happened to him? Where can he be?" "He will have crossed with us and gone home," urged Peryd, hovering unhappily at her shoulder. "We'll ride back. We shall surely find him there before us." "No. No, why should he turn back and never come to the dinner? And if he did, why so late? He would have been home long before I dressed my hair and set out to meet him, if he had changed his mind. And besides, he never would." "I think," said Father Hugh, "that my whole parish has some interest in this matter, and we had better put off everything else, even the services of the church, until we have found Rhydderch and assured ourselves that all is well with him. Truly this may be no more than a tangle of mistiming and misunderstanding, but let us resolve it first, and wonder about it afterwards. There are enough of us here. Let us send out in parties along all the roads that he may have taken, and Shonned shall show us where she thinks his short cut from the upland fields would bring him to the path. He could not well meet with any dangerous beasts in these woods, but he may have had a fall, an injury that has halted or slowed him. Father Prior, will you join with us?"
With all of my heart, said Prior Robert, and so will we all. The less active among them were sent along the open right, with orders to scatter on either side and comb the surroundings as they went, while the more athletic took the narrow footpath beyond Cadwallon stockade. The woods here were not yet close set. There was thick, springy grass under the trees, and no dense undergrowth. They spread out into a half-circle, moving along within a few paces of one another, Shonerd pressing purposely forward up the path with set lips and fixed eyes. Peryd, with every evidence of desperate affection, following close and murmuring agitated urgings into her unheeding ears. Whether he believed in his own reassurances or not, out of all question he was a young man fathoms deep in love, and ready to do anything to serve and protect Shonerd, while she saw in him nothing but the boy from the next holding, and tiresome at that. They were perhaps half a mile beyond Cadwallon's enclosure, when Father Hugh suddenly plucked at Brother Cadfael's sleeve. We have forgotten Brother Jerome and Brother Columbanus. The hill of the chapel is off to the right here. It's no great way. Ask Prior Robert, should we not send and call them to join us? I had indeed forgotten, admitted the prior. Yes, by all means, send someone. Best one of your parishioners. They'll all know the way. One of the young men swerved aside obediently between the trees and ran. The slow-moving scythe swept on into deeper forest. About here, said Shonerd, halting. He would have come down from the clearing. If we go obliquely to the right here, and spread out as before, we shall be covering his likely way. The ground rose, the trees grew closer, the undergrowth thicker. They began to thread the encroaching bushes, having to part company for a few yards, losing sight momentarily of their neighbours. They had gone thus only a short way, when Gwynedd, the smith, crashing through bushes at Brother Cadfael's left hand, uttered a great shout of discovery and dismay, and everyone in the wavering line halted and shook to the sound. Cadfael turned towards the cry, thrusting through thorn branches, and came out in a narrow oval of grass surrounded every way with thick bushes, through which a yews track no wider than a man's shoulders clove the long way of the oak. Just where he must have brushed through into the clear space, Rhyddderch lay on his back, his right hip hollowing the grass under him, shoulders flattened to the ground and arms spread wide. His legs were drawn up under him with bent knees, the left leg crossed over the right. His short, defiant beard pointed at the sky. So, and at the very same slanting angle, did the feathered flight of the arrow that jutted out from under the cage of his ribs. From both sides they gathered, drawn to the smith's call, breaking through bushes like the running of a startled herd of deer, halting appalled around the oval where the body lay. Cadfael went on his knees and looked for any sign of breath within the drawn-back lips, any pulse in the stretched throat or rise and fall of the pierced breast. But there was none. And for that first moment he was the only one who moved within the open space of grass, and what he did was done in strange, too intense silence, as though everyone around him held his breath. Then everything broke out at once in noise and motion. Shonerd clawed through the screening circle and saw her father's body, and uttered a great shriek that was more of a fury even than of grief, and flung herself forward. Peryd caught her by the wrist and pulled her round into his arms, one hand cupped behind her head to press her face into his shoulder. But she shrieked again and struck out at him with all her strength, and, breaking loose, hurled herself to her knees, facing Cadfael, and reached out to embrace her father's body. Cadfael leaned across to ward her off, his hand braced into the grass under Rhyddherch's right armpit. No, touch nothing. Not yet. Let him alone. He has things to tell us. By some intuitive quickness of mind that had not deserted her even at this moment, she obeyed the tone first, and awakened to the words immediately after. Her eyes questioned him, widening, and slowly she sat back in the grass and drew her hands together in her lap. Her lips shaped the words after him silently. Things to tell us? She looked from Cadfael's face into the face of the dead man,
She knew he was dead. She also knew that the dead speak, often in thunder. And she came of proud Welsh stock to which the blood feud is sacred, a duty transcending even grief. Cadfael wondered what troubled him about the palm he had lifted from the grass beside Rhyddherch's breast. Then he knew. Where he knelt, the grass was perceptibly damp from the morning's sharp shower. He could feel the cling of the habit when he shifted his knee. Yet under the outflung right arm, the grass was dry. His hand rose from it with no hint of moisture, no scent of rain. He touched again, ran his fingers up and down alongside Rhyddherch's right flank. He was down to the knee before he felt the dampness and stirred the green fragrance. He felt outwards, the width of the body, to find the same signs. Strange. Very strange. His mind recorded and forbore to wonder then, because there were other things to be observed, and all manner of dangers were falling in upon all manner of people. The tall shape looming at his back, motionless and chill, could be none other than Prior Robert, and Prior Robert in a curious state of exalted shock, nearer to Brother Columbanus's ecstatic fit than he had ever been before, or would ever be again. The high, strained voice asked, over the shuddering quietness of Sioned's tearless sobs, "He is dead?" "Dead," said Cadfael flatly, and looked into Sioned's wide, dry eyes and held them, promising something as yet undefined. Whatever it was, she understood it, and was appeased, for he was Welsh too. He knew about the blood feud, and she was the only heir, the only close kin of a murdered man. She had a task far above sorrow. The prior's voice soared suddenly, awed and exalted. "Behold the saints' vengeance! Tell them what I am saying. Let all other obdurate hearts take warning. Saint Winifred has shown her power and her displeasure." There was hardly any need for translation. They had the sense of it already. A dozen of those standing close shrank warily away. A dozen voices muttered hurried submission. Not for worlds would they stand in the saint's way. "The impious man reaps what he sows," declaimed Robert. "Rhyddherch had his warning, and he did not heed it." The most timorous were on their knees by then, cowed and horrified. It was not as if St. Winifred had meant very much to them until someone else wanted her, and Rhyddherch started a prior claim on behalf of the parish. And Rhyddherch was dead by violence, struck down improbably in his own forests. Sioned's eyes held Cadfael's above her father's pierced heart. She was a gallant girl. She said never a word, though she had words building up in her ripe for saying, spitting rather into Prior Robert's pallid aristocratic alabaster face. It was not she who suddenly spoke up. It was Peryd. "I don't believe it." He had a fine, clear, vehement voice that rang under the branches. There must have been others who had a grudge against Rhyddherch, others whose plans he was obstructing, besides St. Winifred. Why blame this killing on her? This forthright Welsh sense Cadfael translated into English for Robert's benefit, who had caught the dissenting tone of it, but not the contents. "And the young man is right. This arrow never was shot from heaven. Look at the angle of it, up from under his ribs into the heart. Out of the earth, rather." Gwynedd had stood all this time, darkly gazing at the body. Slowly he said, "I know this arrow. I know its owner, or at least the man whose mark it bears." "It's Engleard's," said Gwynedd outright, and 3 or 4 hushed voices bore him out. Engelard was the young outlander who was working Rhyddherch's land. Sioned raised her stricken face, shocked into a false, frozen calm that suddenly melted and crumbled into dread and anger. She rose abruptly, slender and straight, turning her fierce eyes from face to face all around the circle. That moment Cadfael knew the young man was her lover. "Engelard is the most trustworthy of all my father's men, and would cut off his own drawing hand rather than loose against my father's life. Who dares say that this is his work?"
"I don't say so," said Bennet reasonably. "I do say that this is marked as his arrow." "And everybody in Gwithren knows," spoke up a voice from among the Welshmen, not accusing, only pointing out facts, "that he has quarrelled often and fiercely with Rhyddderch over a certain matter at issue between them." "Over me," said Sioned harshly. "Come on, say what you mean. I of all people know the truth best. Better than you all. Yes, they have had high words many times on this one matter, and only this, and would have had more. But for all that, these two have understood each other, and neither of them would have ever done the other harm. Fight they did, but they thought more highly of each other than either did of any of you, and with good reason."
"Yet who can say," said Peryd in a low voice, "how far a man may step aside even from his own nature, for love?"
She turned and looked at him with measuring scorn. "I thought you were his friend."
"So I am his friend," said Peryd, paling but steadfast. "I said what I believe of myself, no less than of him." "What is this matter of one Engelard?" demanded Prior Robert, left behind in this exchange. "Tell me what they are saying." And when Cadfael had done so, as tersely as possible, "It would seem that at least this young man must be asked to account for his movements this day," decreed Robert, appropriating an authority to which he had no direct right here. "It may be that others have been with him, and can vouch for him. He must be questioned." And at that moment they all heard voices approaching from higher up among the woods, a man's voice and a girl's in quick, concerned exchanges, hurrying to discover what was happening. A girl's arm parted the bushes above the oval where they stood, and Annis stepped through and stood in astonishment, gazing round at the inexplicable gathering before her. Another hand, large and gentle, was laid on Annis' shoulder while she hesitated, and moved her aside. Engelard put the girl aside between his hands, as familiarly and serenely as a brother might have done, and stepped past her into the clearing. He had eyes for no one but Sioned. He walked towards her with the straight gait of a proprietor. He had her by the hands when he saw Rhyddherch's body. The shock went into him as abruptly as the arrow must have gone into Rhyddherch, stopping him instantly. What followed was most eloquent. The Saxon youth moved with loving slowness, shutting both Sioned's hands into one of his, and with his freed right hand stroked softly over her hair, down temple and cheek and chin and throat, all with such mastered passion that she was soothed as he meant, while he had barely stopped shaking from the shock. He folded an arm about her, holding her close against his side, and slowly looked all round the circle of watching faces, and slowly down at the body of his lord. His face was bleakly angry. "Who did this?" He looked round. Then Sioned said with clear, deliberate warning, "There are some here are saying that you did it." "I?" he cried, astonished and scornful rather than alarmed, and turned sharply to search her face, which was intent and urgent. Her lips shaped silently. "Run. They're blaming you." It was all she could do, and he understood, for they had such a link between them that meanings could be exchanged in silence, in a look. "Child," said Father Hugh wretchedly, "unless we can find someone who testifies to having seen him elsewhere, at whatever time this deed may have been done, then I fear that we should hold Engelard in safekeeping until the prince's bailiff can take over the charge for us." The men of Gwithren hovered, murmuring, some convinced, many angry, for Rhyddherch had been very well liked, some hesitant, but granting that the outlander ought to be held until his innocence was established or his guilt proved. They shifted and closed, and their murmur became one of consent. "It is fair," said Bennet, and the growl of assent answered him. "One lone Englishman with his back to the wall," whispered Brother John indignantly in Cadfael's ear. "And what chance would he have?" Peryd had stood like a stock all this while, hardly taking his eye from Engelard's face, but to gaze earnestly and unhappily at Shonnet. As Prior Robert levelled an imperious arm at Engelard, and the whole assembly closed in slowly in obedience, braced to lay hands on him, Peryd drew a little further back at the edge of the trees, and Cadfael saw him catch Shonnet's eye, flash her a wild, wide-eyed look, and jerk his head as though beckoning. Out of her exhaustion and misery she roused a brief answering blaze, and leaned to whisper rapidly in Engelard's ear. "Do your duty, all of you," commanded Robert, "to your laws and your prince and your church, and lay hold on this man." There was one instant of stillness, and then they closed in altogether, the only gap in their ranks where Peryd still hung back. Engelard made a long leap from Shonnet's side and was clean through the midst of them, arming off the only one who almost got a grip on him, and made straight for the gap that Peryd had left in their ranks. Father Hugh's voice, uplifted in vexed agitation, called on Peryd to halt him, and Peryd sprang to intercept his flight. How it happened was never quite clear, though Brother Cadfael had a rough idea. But at the very moment when his outstretched hand almost brushed Engelard's sleeve, Peryd stepped upon a rotten branch in the turf that snapped under his foot and rolled, tossing him flat on his face, half-blinded among the bushes. And, winded, possibly, for certainly he made no move to pick himself up until Engelard was past him and away. Even then it was not quite over, for the nearest pursuers on either side, seeing how the hunt had turned, had almost begun to run like hares, on courses converging with the fugitives at the very edge of the clearing. From the left came a long-legged villein of Cadwallans with a stride like a greyhound, and from the right Brother John, his habit flying, his sandalled feet pounding the earth mightily. It was perhaps the first time Brother John had ever enjoyed Prior Robert's whole-hearted approval. It was certainly the last. There was no one left in the race but these three, and fleet though Engelard was, it seemed that the long-legged fellow would collide with him before he could finally vanish. Brother John, diving, caught Cadwallan's villein around the knees and brought him crashing to the ground, and Engelard leaped into the bushes and vanished in a receding susurration of branches until silence and stillness closed over the path of his withdrawal. Brother Richard and Brother Jerome loomed like messengers of doom, one at either side. "Brother John, you are summoned. You are in gross offence." He went with them resignedly. For all the threatening thunderbolts, he had never felt freer in his life. And, having now nothing to lose but his own self-respect, he was sturdily determined not to sacrifice that. "Unfaithful and unworthy brother," hissed Prior Robert, towering in terrible indignation, "what have you done? Do not deny what we have all witnessed. You have not merely connived at the escape of a felon, you have frustrated the attempt of a loyal servant to arrest him. You felled that good man deliberately, to let Engelard go free. Traitor against church and law, you have put yourself beyond the pale. If there is anything you can say in your defence, say it, now." "I thought the lad was being harried beyond reason, on very suspect suspicion," said Brother John boldly. "I've got my own view of him. A decent, open soul, who'd never do violence to any man by stealth, let alone Risiot, whom he liked and valued high. I don't believe that he has any part in his death, and what's more, I think he'll not go far until he knows who had, and God help the murderer then. So I gave him his chance, and good luck to him." The two girls, their heads close together in women's solidarity, interpreted the tone for themselves, if they lacked the words, and glowed in silent applause. Prior Robert was helpless, though he did not know it. Brother Cadfael knew it very well. "Brother Cadfael, ask Father Hugh where there is a safe prison, where he can be held." Cadfael reported sedately. "Father Hugh suggests there is only one place secure enough. If Shonnet is willing to allow a holding to be used, a prisoner could be safe enough there." At this point, Brother John, unaccountably, lost interest in immediate escape. The men of Gwynedd cut young branches and made a green litter to carry Risiot's body home. Under the corpse, when they lifted it, there was much more blood than about the frontal wound. though the point of the arrow barely broke through skin and clothing. When it was time to raise the litter and its burden, now stretched out decently with his twisted legs drawn out straight, and his hands laid quietly at his sides, Shoned looked round for one more to whom she meant to confide a share in this honourable load. She did not find him. "Where is Peryd? What became of him?" No one had seen him go, but he was gone. No one had had attention to spare for him after Brother John had completed what Peryd had begun. He had slipped away without a word, as though he had done something to be ashamed of, something for which he might expect blame rather than thanks. She said no more then, only begged Cadfael with a look to walk with her as she fell in behind the litter. They went some distance, in silence. Then she asked, without looking aside at him, "Did my father yet tell you those things he had to tell?" "Some," said Cadfael. "Not all." "Is there anything I should do, or not do? I need to know. We must make him seemly tonight." "Keep me the clothes that he's wearing, when you take them off him. And take note for me where they are damp from this morning's rain, and where they are dry. If you notice anything strange, remember it. Tomorrow, as soon as I can, I'll come to you." "I must know the truth," she said. "You know why?" Yes, I know. But tonight sing him and drink to him, and never doubt but he'll hear the singing." "Yes," she said, and loosed a great, renewing sigh. "You are a good man. I'm glad that you're here. You do not believe it was Engelard?" "I'm as good as certain it was not." "You've said no word in wonder," she said, "that I have not been troubled over what has become of Engelard, and where he has gone to earth now." "No," said Cadfael, and smiled. "You know where he is, and how to get in touch with him whenever you need. I think you two have 2 or 3 places for secrecy, and in one of them Engelard is resting now, or soon will be. You seem to think that he'll be safe enough. Now tell me nothing, unless you need a messenger or help." "You can be my messenger, if you will, to another," she said. They were emerging from the forest at the edge of Ricciard's home fields, and Prior Robert stood tall and grim and non-committal, aside from their path, his companions discreetly disposed behind him, his hands, features, and the angle of his gently bowed head, all disposed to convey respect for death and compassion for the bereaved, without actually owning to forgiveness of the dead. His prisoner was safely lodged. He was waiting only to collect the last stray from his flock, and make an appropriately impressive exit. "Tell Peryd I missed him from among those my father would have liked to carry him home. Tell him what he did was generous, and I am grateful. I am sorry he should ever have doubted it." They were approaching the gate, and Uncle Maurice, the steward, came out to meet them with his kindly, soft-lined face quaking and shapeless with shock and distress. "And come tomorrow," said Shoned, on an almost soundless breath, and walked away from him alone and entered the gateway after her father's body. Next morning they met in the orchard, the 5 of them, Prior Robert presiding in as solemn dignity as ever. Brother Richard read out the saints to be celebrated that day and the following day. Brother Jerome composed his wiry person into his usual shape of sycophantic reverence and made all the appropriate responses. But it seemed to Cadfael that Brother Columbanus looked unusually withdrawn and troubled, his full blue eyes veiled. The contrast between his athletic build and fine autocratic head, and his meek and anxious devoutness of feature and bearing, was always confusing to the observer. But that morning his extreme preoccupation with some inward crisis of real or imagined sin made it painful to look at him. Brother Cadfael sighed, expecting another falling fit like the one that had launched them on this quest. Who knew what this badly balanced half-saint, half-idiot would do next? "Here we have but one business in hand,"
said Prior Robert firmly, and we shall pursue it as in duty bound. I mean to press more resolutely than ever for our right to take up the relics of the saint and remove them to Shrewsbury. But we must admit at this moment that we have not so far been successful in carrying the people with us. I had great hopes yesterday that all would be resolved. We made every reverent preparation to deserve success. At this point he was interrupted by an audible sob from Brother Columbanus, that drew all eyes to that young man. Trembling and meek, he rose from his place and stood with lowered eyes and folded hands before Robert. "Father Prior, alas, mea culpa, I am to blame. I have been unfaithful, and I desire to make confession." I knew there was something brewing, thought Brother Cadfael, resigned and disgusted. "Speak out," said the prior, not unkindly. Brother Columbanus sank to his knees in the orchard turf. "Father, you sent me with Brother Jerome yesterday to keep vigil in the chapel, and pray earnestly for a good outcome in amity and peace. Oh, Father, my will to keep vigil was good, but the flesh was weak. I had not been half an hour kneeling in prayer when I fell asleep on my arms on the desk, to my endless shame. It is no excuse that I have slept badly and thought much since we came here. Prayer should fix and purify the mind. I slept, and our cause was weakened. I must have slept all the afternoon, for the next thing I remember is Brother Jerome shaking me by the shoulder and telling me there was a messenger calling us to go with him." He caught his breath, and a frantic tear rolled down his cheek, circling the bold, rounded Norman bone. "Oh, now, do not look askance at Brother Jerome, for he surely never knew I had been sleeping, and there is no blame at all to him for not observing and reporting my sin. I awoke as he touched me, and arose and went with him. He thought me as earnest in prayer as he, and knew no wrong." Nobody, probably, had thought of looking askance at Brother Jerome until then, but Cadfael was probably the quickest and the most alert, and the only one who caught the curious expression over Brother Jerome's normally controlled countenance. "Son," said Prior Robert, in an indulgent voice he would certainly never have used to Brother John, "your fault is human, and frailty is in our nature, and you redeem your own error in defending your brother." Further pronouncement was halted by the arrival of Father Hugh. "I am commissioned, Father Prior, to tell you that the people withdraw all opposition to your plans. The relics of St. Winifred are yours to take away with you." Prior Robert drew a great breath of triumph and joy, and whatever will he might have had to deal even the lightest punishment left him in an instant. It was everything that he had hoped for. Brother Columbanus, still kneeling, cast up his eyes radiantly towards heaven, and clasped his hands in gratitude, and somehow contrived to look as though he had brought about this desired consummation himself. "We will go in procession after the next Mass," said the prior, unwonted animation lighting up his severe countenance now that he had had his own way, "and not touch food until we have knelt at St. Winifred's altar and given thanks. I decree that there shall be 3 nights of vigil and prayer before the chapel altar, before ever we break the sod, to confirm to all that what we are doing is indeed right and blessed. We are 6 here. If you will join us, Father Hugh, 2 by 2, we will watch night long in the chapel and pray to be guided rightly." Later that day, Cadfael went up through the woods to Rhyddderch Hall. Shonard was not in the hall, but in the small chamber curtained off at its end, Rhyddderch's private room. And Rhyddderch was private there with his daughter, stretched out straight and still on draped furs, on a trestle table with a white linen sheet covering him. The girl sat beside him, waiting, very formally attired, very grave, her hair austerely braided about her head. She looked older and taller now that she was the lady lord of this holy. But she rose to meet Brother Cadfael with the bright, sad, eager smile of a child sure now of counsel and guidance. "Shonard, may I, with all reverence,
look closely again now at his body. "I know no greater reverence anyone can pay to a murdered man," she said fiercely, "than to seek out by all possible means and avenge him on his murder. Yes, handle him if you must. I'll help you. At least," she said with a pale and bitter smile, "you and I are not afraid to touch him, in case he bleeds in accusation against us." Cadfael was sharply arrested in the act of drawing down the sheet that covered Rhyddherch's body, as though what she had said had put a new and promising idea into his head. True, there are not many who do not believe in that trial. Would you say that everyone here holds by it? Well, don't your people believe it? Don't you? She was astonished, her eyes rounded like a child's. My cloister brothers, yes, I dare say, all or most believe in it. But what I believe, or don't believe, is not to the point. What the murderer believes, well, maybe. No, you have endured enough. Leave him now to me. Nevertheless, she did not turn her eyes away as Cadfael drew off the covering sheet. She must have anticipated the need to examine the body further, for as yet she had left him naked, unshrouded. Washed clean of blood, Rhyddherch lay composed and at rest, a thick, powerful trunk brown to the waist, whiter below. The wound under his ribs, an erect slit, now showed ugly and torn, with frayed bluish lips, though they had done their best to smooth the lacerated flesh together. "I must turn him," said Cadfael. "I need to see the other wound." She did not hesitate, but with the tenderness of a mother rather than a daughter, she slipped an arm under her father's shoulders, and with her free hand flattened under him from the other side, raised the stiffened corpse until he lay on his right side, his face cradled in the hollow of her arm. Cadfael steadied the stretched-out legs, and leaned to peer closely at the wound high on the left side of the back. "You would have trouble pulling out the shaft. You had to withdraw it frontally." "Yes." She shook for a moment, for that had been the worst of the ordeal. "The tip barely broke the skin behind. We had no chance to cut it off. Shame to mangle him so, but what could we do? And yet all that blood." The steel point had indeed little more than punctured the skin, leaving a small blackened spot, dried blood with a bluish bruise around it. But there was a further mark there, thin and clear and faint. From the black spot the brown line of another upright slit extended, a little longer above the arrow mark than below, its length in all about as great as the width of Cadfael's thumb joint, and a faint stain of bruising extending it slightly at either end, beyond where the skin was broken. All that blood, though in fact it was not so very much, though it took Rhyddherch's life away with it, had drained out of this thin slit, and not from the wound in his breast, though that now glared and this lay closed and secret. "I have done," said Cadfael gently, and helped her to lay her father at peace again. "It was there his lifeblood came out," said Cadfael, "and not by the puncture the arrow certainly made, but by a prior wound. A wound made, as I judge, by a long dagger, and a very thin and sharp one, no common working knife. The arrow was driven in from the front after he was dead, to hide the fact that he was stabbed in the back. That was why the ambush took place in thick undergrowth, in a tangled place. That was why he fell on his face, and why, afterwards, he was turned on his back." "Brother Cadfael, who can this murderer be?" she pleaded. "That, God willing," he said, "you and I between us will find out. But at this moment, I cannot judge nor guess. I am utterly astray. What was done, I see, but why, or by whom, I know no more than you. But you have reminded me how the dead are known to rebel against the touch of those who struck them down. And as Rhyddherch has told us much, so he may yet tell us all. He told her then of the 3 nights of prayer and vigil Prior Robert had decreed, and how all the monks and Father Hugh, by turns, would share the duty. Tonight, and for 2 nights following, 2 of us will be keeping watch in the chapel from after compline in the evening until prime in the morning. All 6 of us can be drawn into the same trial, and not one can feel himself singled out. After that, we'll see. Now this, said Brother Cadfael, is what you must do. After compline, in the soft evening light, they all went up, all 6 together, to the wooden chapel and the solitary graveyard, to bring their first pair of pilgrims to the vigil. And there, advancing to meet them in the clearing before the gate, came another procession, 8 of Rhyddderch's household officers and servants, winding down out of the woods with their lord's bier upon their shoulders, and their lord's daughter, now herself their lord, walking erect and dignified before them. "Brother Cadfael," she said, without taking her eyes from Robert's face, "stand by me now, and make my words plain to the Reverend Prior, for I have a prayer to him for my father's sake." Rhyddderch was there at her back, not coffined, only swathed and shrouded in white linen. Gwynedd spoke to Prior Robert. "I have heard that you intend to watch 3 nights in reverence to Saint Winifred before you take her hence with you. I ask for the ease of my father's soul, if he has offended against her, which was never his intent, he may be allowed to lie those 3 nights before her altar in the care of those who keep watch. I ask that they will spare 1 prayer for forgiveness and rest to his soul, only 1, in a long night of prayer. Is that too much to ask?" "It is a fair asking," said Robert, "from a loyal daughter. And after all, he came of a noble family, and knew how to value the ties of blood and birth. He was not all falsity." They installed his green bier on the trestles before the altar, beside the reliquary that awaited St. Winifred's bones. There the party from Rhyddderch's hall left their lord lying in state, and quietly withdrew on the way home. "In the morning," said Gwynedd, before she went with them, "I shall come to say my thanks to those who have asked grace for my father during the night, and so I shall do each morning, before we bury him." She made the reverence due to Prior Robert, and went away without another word, without so much as a glance at Brother Cadfael, drawing the veil close around her face. So far, so good. In the morning, when they went to the chapel, it was to find a fair number of the inhabitants of Gwynedd already gathered there. When the prior and his companions entered the chapel, the first of them to draw near was Gwynedd, with Annis at her elbow. Father Hugh got up from his knees somewhat creakily, leaning on the solid wood of the desk till he could get his old legs straightened and working again. From the other desk beside him, Jerome rose briskly and supply. "A quiet watch," said Hugh. "We have prayed, child, and I trust that we have been heard." "I am grateful," said Gwynedd. "And before you go, you will do 1 more kindness for me and mine, You have prayed for him, and now I ask you to lay your hand, each of you, upon my father's heart, in token of reassurance and forgiveness." People of Gwynedd still as trees in the doorway, but live as trees too, and all eyes as a tree is all leaves, made never a sound, and missed never a move. "Gladly," said Father Hugh, and stepped to the bier and laid his rough hand gently on the stilled heart, and by the wagging of his beard his lips were again moving in silent intercession. All eyes turned upon Brother Jerome, for Brother Jerome was hesitating. He did not look greatly disturbed, but he did look evasive. "If Prior Robert feels it is justified and gives me leave, I will gladly do as I am asked." The watching eyes had changed their quarry, and hung heavily upon the prior. He frowned and considered gravely for some moments, before he gave judgment. "You may do what she wishes, with good conscience." And Brother Jerome, gratefully acknowledging the instruction, stepped readily to the bier and laid his hand upon the swathed heart without a tremor. No spurt of red showed through the shroud to accuse him. Complacently he followed Prior Robert out of the chapel, the others falling in behind, and the silent, staring people fell back from the doorway and let them pass. And where, thought Cadfael, following, does that leave us? Well, we shall see tomorrow, he reasoned, what Robert will do when he's asked for his own forgiveness instead of being generous with another man. However, things did not turn out quite as he had expected. Prior Robert had certainly elected to take that night's watch himself, along with Brother Richard, but as the two were on their way to the chapel, and passing Cadwatlin's holding, the prior was hailed by the gateman, and Cadwatlan himself came hastening to intercept him, with a burly, handsomely dressed Welshman at his heels, in a short riding tunic. The first Cadfael knew of it was when the prior came striding back into Hugh's garden with the stranger beside him, just at the hour when he should have been sinking to his knees in the sombre chapel. "Brother Cadfael, we have a visitor, and I shall require your services. This is Griffith ap Rhys, Prince Owain's bailiff in Ross. I must make my own statement to him and discuss what is to be done. Brother Richard will keep the vigil alone tonight." So there was nothing at all for Shonerd to do when she came the next morning, but to ask Brother Richard, that large, lazy, kindly man, who willed peace and harmony all round him, for his personal pity towards her father, and his benediction in the laying on of hands, which he willingly and guilelessly gave. Brother Cadfael and Brother Columbanus walked up through the woodland together to keep the third night of prayer. "In this quest and this vigil, brother," said Columbanus, his long young steps keeping easy pace with Cadfael's seaman's roll, "we are greatly privileged. The history of our abbey will record our names, and brothers in the generations to come will envy us." "I have already heard," said Cadfael dryly, "that Prior Robert is proposing to write a life of St. Winifred, and complete it with the story of this translation to Shrewsbury. You think he'll record the names of all his companions?" Inside the chapel, a small oil lamp burned with a dark yellow flame on the altar, and Cadfael went forward and lit the 2 altar candles from it and set them one on either side. Brother Columbanus bowed humbly low to the altar and took his place at the desk on the right. Brother Cadfael settled solidly at the one on the left, and with practised movements sought and found the best place for his knees. Stillness came down on them gently. He composed himself for a long watch, and said his prayer to Rhyddderch, not the first he had said for him. He was lost in prayer when he heard the faintest and strangest of sounds issuing from the prie-dieu on his right. Columbanus's eyes were wide open and staring beyond the chapel wall, and his lips open and curved in ecstasy and singing a mere thread of Latin chant in praise of virginity. He gave a great, wordless cry, seemingly both of pain and triumph, and fell forward full length on the earthen floor, crashing to the ground stiffly, arms outspread, body stretched to the very toes, and lay still, his forehead against the trailing fringe of the altar-cloth that spilled from beneath Rhyddherch's body. Cadfael got up in a hurry and went to him, torn between anxiety and alarm on one hand, and disgusted resignation on the other. Exactly what was to be expected of the idiot, he thought with exasperation, even as he was on his knees feeling at the prone brow, and adjusting a fold of the altar drapery under it to ease the position of nose and mouth, turning the young man's head to one side so that he could breathe freely. I should have recognized the signs. Never an opportunity but he can produce a devotional fit or a mystic ecstasy to order. No convulsions this time, at any rate. And now, he thought, what am I supposed to do? Abandon my watch and go down and fetch the prior with help for him? What could they do for him that I cannot do here? If I can't rouse him, then neither could they. Why interfere with a man's peculiar pleasures, if they're doing no harm? It isn't cold here, and he can have one of these altar cloths for a blanket, a fancy that ought to please him. No, we came to watch out the night together, and so we will. I here on my knees, as is due, and he wherever he may be at this moment in his dreams." He covered Columbanus, adjusted the cloths to cushion his head, and went back to his own prie-dieu. Columbanus was in the same condition when Prior Robert came with his fellows, and Sioned with Anest in attendance, and all the people from the village and nearby holdings, silent and watchful as before, to see the end of this 3-night vigil. Sioned was the first to enter. Before Cadfael could rise and turn to reassure her, she had uttered a sharp cry. "What is it? Is he dead?" The prior put her aside quickly, and strode past her, and was brought up short with his foot on the hem of Columbanus's habit. "What happened here? Columbanus, brother?" He stopped and laid his hand upon a rigid shoulder. Columbanus slept and dreamed on, unmoved and unmoving. "Brother Cadfael, what does this mean? What has befallen him?" "He is not dead," said Cadfael, and explained the night's events. "You should have called us to his aid," said the prior, shaken and dismayed. "I had also a duty," said Cadfael shortly, "to remain here and keep the vigil I was sent to keep." "It is true," said the prior, a little reassured. "And he seems at peace, and has a good colour, and no sign of trouble or pain." "This is most strange. Is it possible that this young brother will be the occasion of another such prodigy as when his affliction first drew us to St. Winifred?" With a heavy altar cloth and their girdles, they made a sling in which to carry Columbanus down through the forest to Hugh's house. Cadfael let them go. He turned to look at Sioned, as she was looking at him, with dubious and speculative eyes. "Well, I, at least," he said, "am in my right senses, and can and will do what you have not asked of me." And he stepped to Riziard's side, and laid his hand upon the dead man's heart, and signed his forehead with a cross. She walked beside him as they followed the slow procession down towards the village. "What more can we do? If you know of anything, only tell me. We have not been favoured so far, and today is to be his burial." I know it," said Cadfael, and brooded. "As for this affair in the night, I'm torn 2 ways. I should think it is possible it was all planned, to reinforce our cause with another miracle, but for 2 things. To me, Prior Robert's amazement and concern, however I look at them, seem to be true, not false. And Columbanus has shown these strange properties before, and the way they overtake him is violent and perilous, and it's hard to believe he is feigning. All I know," said Sioned, burning darkly red like a slow torch, "is that my father, whom I loved, is murdered, and I want justice on the murderer." I know, said Cadfael. "I am as Welsh as you. But keep a door open to pity, as who knows when you or I may need it." "And have you spoken with Engelhard? And is all well with him?" She quivered, and flushed, and softened beside him, like a frost-blighted flower miraculously revived by a southern wind. But she did not answer. There was no need. "Ah, you'll live," said Brother Cadfael, satisfied, "as he'd want you to. Even if he did set his face against, like a proper Welsh lord. He'd have got you away in the end. You were right about that. And listen, I have thought of 2 things that you should yet do. We must try whatever we can. Don't go home now. Let Annas take you to Bennet's smithy to rest, and the both of you come to Mass. Who knows what we may learn once our half-fledged saint regains his senses. And then, also, when you bury your father, make certain Peryd comes with his father. He might try to avoid else, if he's eluded you this far. But if you ask him, he cannot refuse. I am still in more minds than one, and none of them very clear, concerning Master Peryd." It was the little brazen bell ringing for Mass that penetrated Brother Columbanus's enchanted sleep at last. Suddenly Columbanus gave a great start, and uttered a soft cry. staring wonderingly about him. He put out a hand and said in a high voice, "Oh, Father, I have been so blessed. I have known such bliss." At the hour of midnight, as I knelt before the altar, I heard a sweet voice crying my name, and I arose and went forward to obey the call. What happened to my body then I do not know. You tell me it was lying as if asleep when you came. But it seemed to me that as I stepped towards the altar, there was suddenly a soft golden light all about it, and there rose up, floating in the midst of the light, a most beautiful virgin, who moved in a miraculous shower of white petals, and distilled most sweet odours from her robe and from her long hair. And this gracious being spoke to me, and told me that her name was Winifred, and that she was come to approve our enterprise, and also to forgive all those who, out of mistaken loyalty and reverence, had opposed it hitherto. And then, oh marvellous goodness, she laid her hand on Rhyddherch's breast, as his daughter has begged us to do in token of our mere personal forgiveness, but she, in divine absolution, and with such perfection and grace, I cannot describe it. "Oh, son," said Prior Robert in rapture, riding over the quivering murmurs that crossed the church like ripples on a pool, "you tell a greater wonder than we dared hope. Even the lost, saved." "It is so, and, Father, there is more. When she laid her hand on him, she bade me speak out to all men in this place, both native and stranger, and make known her merciful will. And it is this: where my bones shall be taken out of the earth, she said, there will be an open grave provided. What I relinquish, I may bestow. In this grave, said Winifred, let Rhyddherch be buried, that his rest may be assured, and my power made manifest." Shonnet, when she heard of this, was outraged. Forgiveness for what? Absolution for what? She might rather have praised him while she was about it, and said outright that he was justified, not forgiven. "Yet a very ambassadorial message," admitted Cadfael appreciatively. "Calculated to get us what we came for. Assuage the people of Gwynedd, make peace all round,
and to placate me, and cause me to give up the pursuit of my father's murderer," said Shonnet, "burying the deed along with the victim, except that I will not rest until I know." And shed reflected glory upon Prior Robert, I was going to say. And I wish I knew which mind conceived the idea. They had met for a few hurried minutes at Bennet's smithy, where Cadfael had gone to borrow mattock and spade for the holy work now to be undertaken. Even a few of the men of Gwynedd had come forward and asked to have a share in breaking the sacred earth, for though they were still reluctant to lose their saint, if it was her will to leave them, they had no wish to cross her. Prodigious things were happening, and they intended to be in receipt of her approval and blessing, rather than run the risk of encountering her arrows. "It seems to me most of the glory is falling rather on Brother Columbanus of late," said Shonnet shrewdly. "And the prior took it meekly, never made any attempt to filch it back from him. That's the one thing that makes me believe he may be honest." She had said something that caused Cadfael to pause and look attentively at her, scrubbing dubiously at his nose. "You well may be right. And certainly this story is bound to go back to Shrewsbury with us, and spread through all our sister houses when we come home with our triumph. Yes, Columbanus will certainly have made himself a great name for holiness and divine favour in the order." "But we're no further forward," said Shonnet bitterly. No, but we have not finished yet." "Tell me what else I am to do." "What I've already told you," said Cadfael. "Have all your household party and friends gathered at the chapel to watch the grave opened, and make sure that Peryd attends." "I've already sent Agnes to beg him to come," said Shonnet. "And then? What have I to say or do to Peryd?" "That silver cross you wear around your neck," said Cadfael. "Are you willing to part with it in exchange for one step ahead towards what you want to know?" "That and all the rest of the valuables I own, you know that."
"Then this," said Cadfael, "is what you will do." With prayers and psalms they carried their tools up to the tangled graveyard by the chapel, and broke the soil of Winifred's grave, digging deep before they came upon the fragile, slender bones of the saint. With further prayers they brought the resplendent coffin out to the lady, to avoid moving her more than they must, and with repeated swathings of linen bound her little bones carefully together and laid her in the coffin. The brothers who made it had realized the need for perfect sealing to preserve the treasure, and taken great pains to make the lid fit down close as a skin, and line the interior with lead. Before St. Winifred was carried back into the chapel for the Thanksgiving Mass, the lid was closed upon her, the catches secured, and at the end of the service the prior's seals were added to make all fast.
"Now that this sacred duty is done,"
said Father Hugh, at once relieved and saddened,
"it is time to attend to the other duty which the saint herself has laid upon us, and bury Rhyddderch honourably, with full absolution, in the grave that she has bequeathed to him."
That burial service was brief, and, after it, 6 of Rhyddderch's oldest and most trusted servants took up the bier of branches, and carried it out to the graveside. The same slings which had lifted St. Winifred waited to lower Rhyddderch into the same bed. Sioned stood beside her uncle, and looked all round her at the circle of her friends and neighbours, and unclasped the silver cross from her neck. "One last gift I want to give to my father, and I would like you, Peryd, to be the one to give it. You have been like a son to him. Will you lay this cross on his breast, where the murderer's arrow pierced him? I want it to be buried with him. It is my farewell to him here. Let it be yours, too." Peryd stood dumbstruck and aghast, staring from her still and challenging face to the silver cross she held out to him. Every eye was on him, and all recorded, though without understanding, the slow draining of blood from his face and his horror-stricken stare. They were already wondering why he made no move, and whispering together in concern at his hanging back. "Come, my son," said Father Hugh kindly, the last to suspect evil. "Don't keep the dead waiting." Peryd fell on his knees suddenly, the cross still clutched in one hand, the other spread to hide his face. "He cannot," he cried hoarsely from behind the shielding palm. "He cannot accuse me. I'm not guilty of murder. What I did was done when Rhyddderch was already dead." A great, gasping sigh passed like a sudden wind around the clearing, and over the tangled grave, and subsided into a vast silence. "Son, Peryd," said Father Hugh firmly, "you have not been charged with any ill-doing by any other but yourself. We are waiting only for you to do what Sioned has asked of you. Therefore do her bidding, or speak out why you will not, and speak plainly." Peryd heard, and ceased to tremble. "Father, I come to confession by constraint, and not gladly, and I am as ashamed of that as of what I have to confess. But it is not murder. I did not kill Rhyddderch. I found him dead." "At what hour?" asked Brother Cadfael, wholly without right, but nobody questioned the interruption. "I went out after the rain stopped. You remember it rained?" They remembered. They had good reason. "It would be a little after noon. I was going up to the pasture outside of Bryn, and I found him lying on his face in that place where afterwards we all saw him. He was dead then, I swear it. And I was grieved, but also I was tempted, for there was nothing in this world I could do for Rhyddderch, but I saw a way—" Peryd swallowed and sighed, bracing his forehead against his fate, and went on. "I saw a means of ridding myself of a rival, of the favoured rival. Rhyddderch had refused his daughter to Engelad, but Sioned had not refused him, and well I knew that there was no hope for me. However, her father urged her, while Engelad was there between us. Men might easily believe that Engelad should kill Rhyddderch, if there was some proof." Brother Cadfael said sternly, "You went so far as to steal one of this unfortunate young man's arrows?
to make sure all eyes turned on him. I did not steal it, though no less discredit to me that I used it as I did. I was out with Engelhard after game, not a week earlier with Rhyddderch's permission. When we retrieved our arrows, I took one of his by error among mine. I had it with me then. Peryder's shoulders had straightened. His head was up, his hands, the right still holding Shonard's cross, hung gently and resignedly at his sides. His face was pale, but calm. He had got the worst of it off his back. After what he had borne alone these last days, confession and penance were balm. Rhyddderch was stabbed in the back, and the dagger withdrawn and gone. I turned him over on his back, and I turned that wound back to front. And I tell you, my hands burn now, but I did it. He was dead. He suffered nothing. I pierced my own flesh, not his. I could tell the line of the wound, for the dagger had gone right through him, though the breast wound was small. I took my own dagger and opened the way for Engelhard's arrow to follow, and I thrust it through and left it standing in him for witness. Love makes men do terrible things, said Peryd, not pleading, but marvelling, even to their friends. Father Hugh broke the silence. Son Peryd, he said, you stand in dire sin and cannot be excused. Such violation of the image of God cannot go unpunished. God forbid, said Peryd humbly, that I should escape any part of what is due. I want it. I cannot live with myself if I have only this present self to live with. Child, if you mean that, then give yourself into my hands to be delivered up both to secular and religious justice. As to the law, I shall speak with the prince's bailiff. As to the penance due before God, that is for me, as you are confessor, and I require that you shall wait my considered judgment. So I will, father, said Peryd. I want no unearned pardon. I take penance willingly. Then you need not despair of grace. Go home now, and remain within doors until I send for you. I will be obedient to you in all things, but I have one prayer before I go. He turned slowly and faced Shonard. May I now do what you asked of me? I am not afraid now. He was a fair man always. He won't accuse me of more than my due. Her face was thoughtful and intent. Yes, she said. I still wish it. Peryd went forward steadily enough now, sank to his knees beside Rhyddderch's body, and laid first his hand, and then Shonard's cross, upon the heart he had pierced, and no gush of blood sprang at his touch. The evening was drawing in by the time they had buried Rhyddderch, and it was too late for Prior Robert and his companions to take their prize and leave at once for home, even if it had been a seemly thing to do, after all that had happened. Some ceremony was due to the community the saint was leaving, and the houses that had offered hospitality freely even to those who came to rob them. We will stay this night over, and sing vespers and compline in the church with you, and give due thanks, said the prior. And after compline, one of us will again watch the night through with St. Winifred, as is only proper. Cadfael fell in beside Shonard, as the subdued straggling procession made its way home towards the village. Well, he said resignedly, it was worth trying, and we can't say it got us nothing. At least we know now who committed the lesser crime, if we are very little nearer knowing who committed the greater. And tomorrow, she said sadly, Prior Robert will take his saint and all his brothers, and you with them, and set out for home, and I shall be left with nobody to turn to here. And Engelhard must go on hiding, as well you know. Peryder's plot against him is quite empty now. We all know that. But does that prove he did not kill my father, after a raging quarrel? In the back, said Cadfael, unguardedly indignant. She smiled. All that proves is that you know him. Not everyone does. Some will be saying at this moment, perhaps, after all, that Peryd may have been right without even knowing it. He thought about it
and was dismayed, for no question. She was right. "There is also Brother John to be considered," said Sioned. It may well be that Anest, walking behind, had prodded her. "I have not forgotten Brother John," agreed Cadfael. "But I think the bailiff well may have done. He would shut his eyes or look the other way if Brother John left for Shrewsbury with the rest of you. He has troubles enough here. What does he want with alien trouble? And if Brother John should seem to him to have left for Shrewsbury, he would be satisfied? Ask no questions about one more outlander taken up by a patron here?" "I always knew you were quick," said Sioned, brown and bright and animated, almost herself again. "But would Prior Robert pursue him still, when he hears he's gone from custody? I don't see him as a forgiving man." No, nor he is. But how would he set about it? The Benedictine order has no real hold in Wales. No, I think he'd let it ride, now he has what he came for. I'm more concerned for Engelhard. Give me this one more night, child, and do this for me. Send your people home, and stay the night over with Anest at Bennett's Croft. And if God aids me with some new thought, for never forget, God is more deeply offended even than you or I by this great wrong, I'll come to you there." "We'll do that," said Sioned, "and you'll surely come." They had slowed to let the cortege move well ahead of them, so they could talk freely. They were approaching the gatehouse of Cadwatlan's holding, and Father Hugh, issuing forth in haste and agitation in search of help, seemed relieved rather than dismayed to find only Cadfael within call. "Brother Cadfael, will you spare some minutes for this afflicted household? You have some skills with medicines. You may be able to advise." "His mother," whispered Sioned, in immediate reassurance. "She weeps herself into a frenzy at everything that crosses her. I knew this would set her off. Poor Peryd, he has his penance already. Shall I come?" No, you'd better not," he said softly, and moved to meet Father Hugh. Sioned was, after all, the innocent cause of Peryd's fall from grace. She would probably be the last person calculated to calm his mother's anguish. Dame Branwen was indeed audible before they even entered the small room where husband and son were trying to soothe her. Cadwatlan on one side, and Peryd on the other, stroked and patted and comforted in vain. "Mother," said Peryd, haggard and sweating worse than when he faced Rizyart's body, "nobody blames you, and nobody will." At that she let out a great wail of grief. Brother Cadfael took Peryd firmly by the sleeve and hauled him away to the back of the room. "Show a little sense, lad, and take yourself out of her sight. You're fuel to her fire. Show me where Jerome and Columbanus lodge. Columbanus brought some of my poppy syrup with him, in case of need. The phial should be there, with his scrip, and as far as I know, he's had no occasion to use it. His cantrips here in Wales have been of a quieter kind. We can find a use for it now." "What does it do?" asked Peryd, wide-eyed. "It soothes the passions and kills pain, either of the body or the spirit." "I could use some of that myself," said Peryd, with a wry smile, and led the way out to one of the small huts that lined the stockade. Brother Cadfael opened first one leather scrip and then the other, and in the second found what he was seeking. He drew it out and held it up to the light, a small phial of greenish glass. Even before he saw the line of the liquid in it, its light weight had caused him to check and wonder. Instead of being full to the stopper with the thick, sweet syrup, the bottle was 3/4 empty. Brother Cadfael stood stock still for a moment, with the phial in his hand, staring at it in silence. Certainly Columbanus might at some time have felt the need to forestall some threatening spiritual disturbance, but Cadfael could recall no occasion when he had said any word to that effect, or shown any sign of the rosy, reassuring calm the poppies could bring. There was enough gone from the bottle to restore serenity 3 times over, enough to put a man to sleep for hours. And now that he came to think back, there had been at least one occasion when a man had slept away hours of the day, instead of keeping the watch he was set to keep. The day of Rizyart's death, Columbanus had failed of his duty, and confessed as much with heartfelt penitence.
Columbanus, who had the syrup in his possession and knew its use. "What must we do?" asked Peryd, uneasy in the silence. "If it tastes unpleasant, you'll have trouble getting her to drink it." "It tastes sweet." But there was not very much of it left. "Go and get a cup of strong wine, and we'll see how that goes down," said Cadfael. They had taken with them a measure of wine that day, he remembered, the ration for the two of them, when they set off for the chapel. Columbanus had drawn and carried it, and a bottle of water for himself, since he had made an act of piety of renouncing wine until their mission was accomplished. Jerome had done well, getting a double ration. Brother Cadfael stirred himself out of his furious thoughts to deal with the immediate need of Peryd's mother, who was much soothed after taking the potion. Father Hugh was immensely relieved. "What should we have done without you, Brother Cadfael?" "Both men and women partake of the same human nature, Hugh. We both bleed when we're wounded. You go to supper now, and hold me excused, and if I can be with you before Compline, I will. I have some business first at Gwynnedd's smithy." The empty phial swung heavily in the pocket in his right sleeve, reminding him. His mind was still busy with the implications. Before ever he reached Gwynnedd's croft, he had it clear in his mind what must be done, and was no nearer knowing how to set about it. Kai was with Gwynedd on the bench under the eaves, with a jug of rough wine between them. They were not talking, only waiting for him to appear, and there could be no reason for that but that Shonard had told them positively that he would. "A fine tangle, it turns out," said Gwynedd, shaking his grizzled head. "And now you'll be off and leave us holding it. No blame to you. You have to go where your duty is. But what are we to do about Rhyddderch when you're gone?" "God knows we never meant to bring trouble," said Cadfael. "But there's still tonight before we go, and I haven't shot my last bolt yet. I must speak with Shonard. We've things to do, and not much time for doing them." Prior Robert and Brother Richard rode into Rhyddderch yard with the prince's bailiff between them, his two henchmen and Brother Cadfael close behind, at about 7:30 in a mild twilight, with all the unhurried ceremony of the law, rather as if Griffith ap Rhys held his commission from St. Benedict himself, and not from Owain Gwynedd. Suddenly Annis came running with her skirts gathered in her hands, and her light brown hair slipping out of its glossy coil to her shoulders. "Oh, sirs, you must excuse us this neglect. We've been so disturbed. The gatekeeper was called away to help, and all the grooms are hunting." "We don't propose to stay," said Griffith ap Rhys, already suspecting this artlessness and approving the way she radiated it. "We came to relieve you of a certain young malefactor you've had in hold here, but it seems that you've suffered some further calamity, and we should be sorry to add to your troubles." "Madam," said Prior Robert, civilly but officiously, "you are addressing the prince's bailiff of Ross, and I am the prior of Shrewsbury Abbey. You have a brother of that abbey in confinement here. The royal bailiff is come to relieve you of his care." All of which Cadfael duly and solemnly translated for Annest's benefit, his face as guileless as hers. "Oh, sirs!" She opened her eyes wide and curtsied deeply to Griffith, and cursorily to the prior, separating her own from the alien. "It's true, we had such a brother here, a prisoner." "Had?" said Robert sharply, for once detecting the change of tense. "Had?" said Griffith, thoughtfully. "He's gone, sir. You see what confusion he's left behind. This evening, when his keeper took him his supper, this brother struck him down with a board torn loose from the manger in his prison, and dropped the bolt on him and slipped away. It was some time before we knew. He must have climbed the wall. You see, it is not so high. We have men out now looking for him in the woods and searching everywhere here within, but I hear that he's clean gone." Kai made his entrance at the perfect time, issuing from one of the barns with shaky steps, his head wreathed in a white cloth lightly dabbed with red. "Poor man! The villain broke his head for him. It was some time before he could drag himself to the door and hammer on it and make himself heard. There's no knowing how far the fellow may have got by now, but the whole household is out hunting for him." The bailiff, as in duty bound, questioned Kai, but gently and briefly questioned all the other servants, who ran to make themselves useful and succeeded only in being magnificently confusing. And Prior Robert, burning with vengeful zeal, would have pressed them more strenuously, but for the bailiff's presence and obvious prior right, the brevity of the time at his disposal if he was to get back for Compline. In any case, it was quite clear that Brother John was indeed over the wall and clean gone. "The wretch compounds his offence," said Robert, furious. "But I cannot allow his villainy to disrupt my mission. I must set out for home tomorrow, and leave his capture to you." "You may trust me to deal properly with him," said Griffith dryly, "when he is found." With that, Prior Robert had to be content, though his Norman spirit burned at being deprived of its rightful victim. He was in no very Christian mood when he swept into Father Hugh's church, only just in time for Compline. They were all there but Brother John, the remaining 5 brethren from Shrewsbury, and a good number of the people of Gwynedd, to witness the last flowering of Brother Columbanus's devotional gift of ecstasy, now dedicated entirely to St. Winifred, his personal patroness, who had healed him of madness, favoured him with her true presence in a dream, and made known her will through him in the matter of Rhyddderch's burial. For, at the end of Compline, rising to go to his self-chosen vigil, Columbanus turned to the altar, raised his arms in a sweeping gesture, and prayed aloud in a high, clear voice that the virgin martyr would deign to visit him once more in his holy solitude, in the silence of the night, and reveal to him again the inexpressible bliss from which he had returned so reluctantly to this imperfect world. And more, that this time, if she found him worthy of translation out of the body, she would take him up living into that world of light. Brother Columbanus entered the small, dark, wood-scented chapel, heavy with the odours of centuries, and closed the door gently behind him without latching it. Beyond the capsule of soft golden light from the small oil lamp on the altar, all was darkness, perfumed with age and dust. Brother Columbanus made his obeisance to the altar, briefly and almost curtly. He moved the second prayer desk aside and set the chosen one squarely in the centre of the chapel, facing the bier. Columbanus then padded the prie-dieu for his knees with the bunch skirts of his habit, and made himself as comfortable as possible, with his gowned arms broadly folded as a pillow for his head. A drowsiness came stealing over him, and he slept. It seemed, after the fashion of sleep, no time at all before he was startled awake, but in fact it was more than 3 hours, and midnight was approaching. A woman was calling him by name, low and clearly, and over again. "Columbanus! Columbanus! Columbanus, what have you done?" Out of the reliquary the voice came, out of the light that was dwindling, even as he stared in terror and unbelief. "Columbanus! Columbanus, my false servant, who blasphemes against my will and murders my champions, what will you say in your defence to Winifred? Do you think you can deceive me as you deceive your prior and your brothers? Why?" demanded the voice, cold, peremptory, and menacing in its stillness. "Have you killed my servant, Rhyddderch?" "No!" croaked Columbanus, forcing out words in a frantic haste. I never touched Rhyddderch. I was here, in your chapel, Holy Virgin." "Liar that you are! Who carried the wine? Who put a sleeping potion in the wine, causing even the innocent to sin?" "Brother Jerome slept, and not you. You went out into the forest and waited for Rhyddderch, and struck him down." No, I swear it." Shaking and swearing, he clawed at the desk before him, and could get no leverage with his palsied hands to prise himself to his feet and fly from her. "Fool!" said the voice in a sudden loud cry. "Do you think that you can deceive me? Then what is this?" There was a sudden silvery flash in the air before him, and something fell and smashed with a shivering of glass on the floor just in front of the desk. spattering his knees with sharp fragments and infinitesimal sticky drops, and at the same instant the flame of the lamp died utterly, and black darkness fell. Shivering and sick with fear, Columbanus groped forward along the earth floor, and slivers of glass crushed and stabbed under his palms, drawing blood. He lifted one hand to his face, whimpering, and smelled the sweet, cloying scent of the poppy syrup, and knew that he was kneeling among the fragments of the phial he had left safe in his scrip at Cadwallan's house. Then the total darkness eased. There was a figure standing motionless between him and the bier. The figure of a slender, still form, swathed from head to foot closely in white, Winifred in her grave clothes, long since dust, a thin veil covering her face and head, and her arm outstretched and pointing at him. He shrank before her, scuffling abjectly backwards along the floor, making feeble gestures with his hands to fend off the very sight of her. Frantic tears burst out of his eyes, and frantic words from his lips. "It was for you. It was for you and for my abbey. I did it for the glory of our house. I believed I had warranty from you and from heaven. Rhyddderch stood in the way of God's will. He would not let you go. I meant only rightly when I did what I did." "Speak plainly," said the voice, sharp with command, "and say out what you did." I gave the syrup to Jerome in his wine, and when he was asleep, I stole out to the forest path and waited for Rhyddderch. I followed him. I struck him down. Oh, sweet Winifred, don't let me be damned for striking down the enemy who stood in the way of blessedness." She was advancing upon him, and now in bitter, quiet fury, jetting menace from her outstretched fingertips. Columbanus broke out in frenzied fear, clawed himself upright by the wall, and struck out with both hands, beating at her blindly to fend her off from touching, and uttering thin, babbling cries as he flailed about him. His left hand caught in her draperies and dragged the veil from her face and head. Dark hair fell around her shoulders. His fingers made contact with the curve of a smooth, cool cheek. Cool, but not cold. Smooth with the graceful curves of firm, young flesh, where, in his sick horror, he had expected to plunge his hand into the bony hollows of a skull. He uttered a scream that began in frantic terror and ended in soaring triumph. The hand that had shrunk from contact turned suddenly to grasp hold, knotting strong fingers in the dark tangle of hair. He was very quick, Columbanus. It took him no more than the intake of a breath to know he had a flesh-and-blood woman at the end of his arm, and scarcely longer to know who she must be, and what she had done to him with this intolerable trap in which she had caught him. It was his misfortune that Shonard was almost as quick in the uptake as he. She sprang back from him by instinct, but his clawing caught at the linen sheet that draped her. She swung round to her left to put as much distance as she could between her body and his right hand, but she saw him lunge into the breast of his habit, and saw the brief, sullen flash of the steel as he whipped it out and followed her swing, hacking into dimness. The same dagger, she thought, swooping beneath its first blind stab, that killed my father. Somewhere a door had opened fully on the night, for the wind blew through the chapel suddenly, and sandaled feet thudded in with the night air. A thick-set, powerful body driving the draught before it. A loud voice thundered warning. Brother Cadfael erupted into the chapel from the sacristy like a bolt from a crossbow, and drove at full speed into the struggle. Sensing the danger he was suddenly in, Columbanus broke free, and was gone, hurtling out at the door in full flight. And Brother Cadfael was embracing Shonard with strong, sustaining arms, and upbraiding her with a furious, bracing voice. "For God's sake, fool daughter, why did you get within his reach? I told you, keep the beer between you and him." "Get after him," shouted Shonard wrathfully. "Do you want him clean away? I'm sound enough. Go, get him. He killed my father." They headed for the door together, but Cadfael was out of it first. Shonard was close on his heels as he rolled like a thunderbolt down the narrow path through the graveyard towards the gate. The night was huge, velvet, sown with stars, their veiled and delicate light barely casting shadows. All that quiet space received and smothered the sound of their passage, and smoothed the stillness of the night over it.
Out of the bushes beyond the graveyard wall, a man's figure started, tall, slender, and swift, leaping to block the gateway. Columbanus saw him, and balked for a moment. But Cadfael was running hard behind him, and the next instant the fugitive made up his mind and rushed on, straight at the shadow that moved to intercept him. Hard on Cadfael's heels, Gwynedd suddenly shrieked, "Take care, Engelard! He has a dagger!" Engelard heard her, and swerved to the right at the very moment of collision, so that the stroke meant for his heart only ripped a fluttering ribbon of cloth from his sleeve. Columbanus would have bored his way past at speed and run for the cover of the woods, but Engelard's long left arm swept around hard into the back of his neck, sending him off balance for a moment, although he kept his feet, and Engelard's right fist got a tight grip on the flying cowl and twisted. Half-strangled, Columbanus whirled again and struck out with the knife, and this time Engelard was ready for the flash, and took the thrusting wrist neatly in his left hand. They swayed and wrestled together, feet braced in the grass, and they were very fairly matched, if both had been armed. That unbalance was soon amended. Engelard twisted at the wrist that he held, ignoring the clawing of Columbanus's free hand at his throat, and the numbed fingers opened at last and let the dagger fall. Both lunged for it, but Engelard scooped it up and flung it contemptuously aside into the bushes, and grappled his opponent with his bare hands. The fight was all but over. Columbanus hung panting and gasping, both arms pinned, looking wildly around for a means of escape, and finding none. "Is this the man?" demanded Engelard. Gwynedd said, "Yes, he has owned to it." Engelard looked beyond his prisoner then for the first time, and saw her standing in the soft starlight that was becoming to their accustomed eyes almost as clear as day. He saw her dishevelled and bruised, and gazing with great shocked eyes, her left arm gashed and bleeding freely, although the cut was shallow. He saw smears of blood dabbling the white sheet in which she was swathed. By starlight, there is little or no colour to be seen, but everything that Engelard saw at that moment was blood-red. This was the man who had murdered in coward's fashion Engelard's well-liked lord and good friend, whatever their differences, and now he had tried to kill the daughter as he had killed the father. "You dared touch her!" blazed Engelard in towering rage. "You worthless cloister rat!" And he took Columbanus by the throat and hoisted him bodily from the ground, shook him like the rat he had called him, cracked him in the air like a poisonous snake, and when he had done with him, flung him down at his feet in the grass. "Get up," he growled, standing over the wreckage. "Get up now, and I'll give you time to rest and breathe, and then you can fight a man to the death without a dagger in your hand, instead of writhing through the undergrowth and stabbing him in the back, or carving up a defenceless girl. Take your time. I can wait to kill you till you've got your breath." Gwynedd flew to him, breast to breast, and held him fast in her arms, pressing him back. No, please, don't touch him again. I don't want the law to have any hold on you, even the slenderest. He tried to kill you. You're hurt." No, it's nothing. It's only a cut. It bleeds, but it's nothing." His rage subsided slowly, shaking him. He folded his arms around her and held her to him, and with a disdainful but restrained jab of a toe, urged his prostrate enemy again. "Get up, get up. I won't touch you. The law can have you, and welcome." Columbanus did not move, not by so much as the flicker of an eyelid or the twitching of a finger. All three of them stood peering down at him in sudden silence, aware how utterly still he was, and how rare such stillness is among living things. "He is foxing," said Engelard scornfully, "for fear of worse, and by way of getting himself pitied. I've heard he's a master at that." Those who feign sleep and hear themselves talked of usually betray themselves by some exaggeration of innocence. Columbanus lay in a stillness that was perfectly detached and indifferent. Brother Cadfael knelt down beside him, shook him by the shoulder gently, and sat back with a sharp sigh at the broken movement of the head. He put a hand inside the breast of the habit, and stooped to the parted lips and wide nostrils. Then he took the head between his hands, and gently turned and tilted it. It rolled back as he released it, into a position so improbable that they knew the worst even before Cadfael said, quite practically, "You'd have waited a long time for him to get his breath back, my friend. You don't know your own strength. His neck is broken. He's dead." Sobered and shocked, they stood dumbly staring down at what they had hardly yet recognized for disaster. They saw a regrettable accident which neither of them had ever intended, but which was, after all, a kind of justice. But Cadfael saw a scandal that would yet wreck their young lives, and others too, for without Columbanus alive, and forced by 2 respected witnesses to repeat his confession, how strong was all their proof against him? Cadfael sat back on his heels and thought. It was startling to realize, and now that the unmoved silence of the night came down on them again, how all this violence and passion had passed with very little noise, and no other witnesses. He listened, and no stirring foot or wing troubled the quiet. They were far enough away from any dwelling. Not a soul had been disturbed. That, at least, was time gained. "He can't be dead," said Engelard doubtfully. "I barely handled him at all. Nobody dies as easily as that." "This one did. And now what's to be done? I hadn't bargained for this." He said it not complainingly, but as one pointing out that further urgent planning would now be necessary, and they had better keep their minds flexible. Why, what can be done?" To Engelard it was simple, though troublesome. "We shall have to call up Father Hugh and your prior, and tell them exactly what happened. I mean, what else can we do? I'm sorry to have killed the fellow. I never meant to, but I can't say that I feel any guilt about it." Nor did he expect any blame. The truth was always the best way. Cadfael felt a reluctant affection for such innocence. The world was going to damage it sooner or later, but one undeserved accusation had so far failed even to bruise it. He still trusted men to be reasonable. Cadfael doubted if Shoned were so sure. Her silence was anxious and foreboding, and her grazed arm was still oozing blood. First things first, and they might as well be sensibly occupied while he thought. Here, make yourself useful. Help me to get this carrion back into the chapel out of sight. And, Shoned, find his dagger. We can't leave that lying about to bear witness. And let's get that arm of yours washed and bound up. There's a stream at the back of the hawthorn hedge there, and of linen we have plenty. They had absolute faith in him, and did his bidding without question, though Engelard, once he had assured himself that Shoned was not gravely hurt, and had himself carefully and deftly bandaged her scratch, returned to his dogged opinion that their best course was to tell the whole story, which could hardly cast infamy upon anyone but Columbanus. Cadfael busied himself with flint and tinder until he had candles lighted and the lamp refilled, from which he himself had drained a judicious quantity of oil before Shoned took her place under the draperies of the saint's catafalque. "You think," he said at length, "that because you've done nothing wrong, and we've all of us banded together to expose a wrong, that the whole world will be of the same opinion, and honestly come out and say so? Child, I know better. The only proof we have of Columbanus's guilt is his confession, which both of us here heard, or rather, the only proof that we had, for we no longer have even that. Alive, we too could have forced the truth out of him a second time. Dead? He's never going to give us that satisfaction. And without that, our position is vulnerable enough. No, make no mistake. If we accuse him, if this fearful scandal breaks to smirch the Abbey of Shrewsbury and all the forces of the Benedictine order, backed here by the bishop and the prince, you take my word for it, all the forces of authority will band together to avert the disaster, and nobody, much less a friendless outlander, will be allowed to stand in their way. They simply can't afford to have their acquisition of St. Winifred called in question and brought to disrepute. Rather than that, they'll call this an outlaw killing by a desperate man, a fugitive already, wanted for another crime, and trying to escape both together. A pity, he said. I ever suggested that Gwynedd should call you in to wait in reserve, in case we had trouble. But none of this is your fault, and I won't have you branded with it. I made the plot, and I must unravel it. But give up all idea of going straight to Father Hugh, or the bailiff, or anyone else with the true story. Far better use the rest of this night to rearrange matters to better advantage. Justice can be arrived at by more routes than one. They wouldn't dare doubt Gwyned's word, said Englard stoutly. Fool boy. They'd say that Gwynedd, for love's sake, might go as far aside from her proper nature as Peryd did. And as for me, my influence is small enough, and I am not interested in protecting only myself, but as many of those in this coil as I can reach. Even my prior, who is arrogant and rigid, and to tell the truth sometimes rather stupid, but not a murderer, and not a liar, and my order which has not deserved Columbanus. Hush now, and let me think. And while I do, you can be clearing away the remains of the syrup bottle. This chapel must be as neat and quiet tomorrow as before we ever brought our troubles into it. Obediently they went about removing the traces of the night's alarms, and let him alone until he should have found them away through the tangle. And I wonder now, he said at length, what made you improve on all the speeches that I made for you, and put such fiery words into St. Winifred's mouth? What put it into your head to say that you'd never wanted to leave Gwynedd, and did not want it now? That Rhyddderch was not merely a decent, honest man, but you a chosen champion. She turned and looked at him in astonishment and wonder. Did I say that? You did, and very well you delivered it too, and very proper and apt it sounded, but I think we never rehearsed it so. Where did you get the words? I don't know, said Gwynedd, puzzled. I don't remember what I did say. The words seemed to come freely out of themselves. I only let them flow. It may be, said Englard, that the saint was taking her chance when it was offered. All these strangers having visions and ecstasies and interpreting them to suit themselves, yet nobody ever really asked St. Winifred what she wanted. They all claimed they knew better than she did. Out of the mouths of innocence, said Cadfael to himself, and pondered the road that was gradually opening before his mind's eye. Of all the people who ought to be left happy with the outcome, St. Winifred should surely come first. Aim, he thought, at making everybody happy, and if that's within reach, why stir up any kind of unpleasantness? Take Columbanus, for instance. Only a few hours ago at Compline, he prayed aloud before us all, that if the Virgin deemed him worthy, he might be taken up out of this world this very night, translated instantly out of the body. Well, that was one who got his wish. Maybe he'd have withdrawn his request if he'd known it was going to be taken up so literally, for its purpose was rather to reflect incomparable holiness upon him while he was still alive to enjoy it. But saints have a right to suppose that their devotees mean what they say, and bestow gifts accordingly. And if the saint has really spoken through Gwynedd, he thought, and who am I to question it? If she really wants to stay here in her own village, which is a reasonable enough wish, well, the plot where she used to sleep has been newly turned today. No one will notice anything if it's turned again tonight. I believe, said Gwynedd, watching him with the first faint smile, wan but trusting, you're beginning to see your way. I believe, said Cadfael, I'm beginning to see our way, which is more to the point. Gwynedd, I have something for you to do, and you need not hurry. We have work to do here while you're away. Take that sheet of yours, and go and spread it under the may trees in the hedge, where they're beginning to shed, but not yet brown. Shake the bushes, and bring us a whole cloud of petals. The last time she visited him, it was with wondrous sweet odours and a shower of white flowers. Bring the one, and we shall have the other. Confidently, understanding nothing as yet, she took the linen sheet from which she had unwound herself, as from a shroud, and went to do his bidding. Give me the dagger, Englard, said Cadfael briskly when she was gone. He wiped the blade on the veil Columbanus had torn from Shoned's head, and moved the candles there so that they shone upon the great red seals that closed Winifred's reliquary. "Thank God he didn't bleed," he said. "His habit and clothes are unmarked. Strip him." And he fingered the first seal, nodded satisfaction at its fastness and the thinness and sharpness of the dagger, and thrust the tip of the blade into the flame of the lamp. Long before daylight, they were ready. They walked down, all three together, from the chapel towards the village, and separated at the edge of the wood where the shortest path turned off uphill towards Rhyddderch's holding. Shoned carried with her the blood-stained sheet and veil and the fragments of glass they had buried in the forest. A good thing the servants who had filled in Rhyddderch's grave had left their spades on the scene, meaning to tidy the mound next day. That had saved a journey to Borrow without leave, and a good hour of time. "There'll be no scandal," said Cadfael, when they halted at the place where the paths divided. "No scandal, and no accusations. I think you may take Engelard home with you, but keep him out of sight until we're gone. There'll be peace when we're gone, and you needn't fear that the prince or his bailiff will ever proceed further against Engelard any more than against John. I'll speak a word in Peryder's ear. Peryd will speak it into the bailiff's ear. The bailiff will speak it into Owain Gwyned's ear. Or Father Hugh will leave out of it. There's no need to burden his conscience, the good simple man. And if the monks of Shrewsbury are happy, and the people of Gwynedd are happy, for they'll hear the whisper fast enough, why should anyone want to upset such a satisfactory state of affairs by speaking the word aloud? A wise prince, and Owain Gwynedd seems to be very wise, will let alone." "All Gwynedd," said Shoned, and shivered a little at the thought, "will be there in the morning to watch you take the reliquary away?" "So much the better. We want all the witnesses that we can have, all the emotion, all the wonder. I am a great sinner," said Cadfael philosophically, "but I feel no weight. Does the end justify the means, I wonder?" "One thing I know," she said. "My father can rest now, and that he owes to you, and I owe you that, and more. Child, I shall remember you all my life, but your love, my children, and how you manage it, with that I can't help you." "No need," said Engelard. "I am an outlander with a proper agreement. That agreement can be dissolved by consent, and I can be a free man by dividing all my goods equally with my lord, and now Shoned is my lord." "And then there can be no man prevent," said Shoned, "if I choose to endow him with half of my goods, as is only fair. Uncle Moiris won't stand in our way, and it won't even be hard for him to justify. To marry an heiress to an outlander servant is one thing. To marry her to a free man, and heir to a manor, even if it's in England and can't be claimed for a while, is quite another." It seemed that those two, at any rate, were satisfied, and Rhyddderch, in his honoured grave, would not grudge them their happiness. He had not been a grudging man. Engelard, no talker, said his thanks plainly and briefly when they parted. Shoned turned back impulsively, flung her arms around Cadfael's neck, and kissed him. It was their farewell, for he had thought it best to advise them not to show themselves at the chapel again. It was a wry touch that she smelled so heady and sweet with flowering May, and left so saintly a fragrance in his arms when she was gone. On his way down to the parsonage, Cadfael made a detour to the mill pond, and dropped Columbanus's dagger into the deepest part of the dark water. What a good thing, he thought, making for the bed he would occupy for no more than an hour or so before prime, that the brothers who made the reliquary were such meticulous craftsmen, and insisted on lining it with lead. Prior Robert arose and went to the first service of the day in so great content with his success that he had almost forgotten about the escape of Brother John. It was a clear, radiant morning when they came from the church and turned towards the old graveyard and the chapel, and all the congregation fell in at their heels and followed. Now they were approaching the little clearing. The woodlands fell back from them on either side. The narrow field of wild grass opened, and then the stone-built wall, green from head to foot, of the old graveyard. Small, shrunken, black, a huddled shape too tall for its base, the chapel of St. Winifred loomed, and at its eastern end the raw, dark oblong of Rhyddderch's grave scarred the lush spring green of the grass. Prior Robert halted at the gate, and turned to face the following multitude with a benign and almost affectionate countenance, and, through Cadfael, addressed them thus. Father Hugh, and good people of Gwynedd, we came here desiring to honour St. Winifred as she had instructed us, and not at all to deprive you of a treasure, rather to allow its beams to shine upon many more people as well as you. Now you are assured that we meant no evil, but only good, and that what we are doing is done reverently. A murmur began at one end of the crescent of watchers, and rolled gently around to the other extreme, a murmur of acquiescence, almost of complacency. It was altogether too good. They knew already. Whether through some discreet whisper started on its rounds by Shoned, or by some earth-rooted intuition of their own, the people of Gwynedd knew, in essence if not in detail, everything there was to be known. And not a word aloud, not a word out of place, until the strangers were gone. Come then, said Prior Robert, deeply gratified. Let us release Brother Columbanus from his vigil, and take St. Winifred on the first stage of her journey home. With a long, white, aristocratic hand, he thrust the door wide, and stood in the doorway. Brother Columbanus, we are here. Your watch is over. He took just 2 paces into the interior. The prie-dieu stood centrally before the bier, but there was no one kneeling there. Over altar and reliquary, a snowdrift of white petals lay, and carried as far as the prie-dieu, and sprinkled both it and the crumpled, empty garments that lay discarded there. Columbanus? What is this? He is not here. Brother Richard came to the prior's left shoulder. Brother Jerome was on his right. Gwynedd and Cadfael and Kai and others crowded in after him, and leaned to look more closely at all that was left of Brother Columbanus. The black Benedictine habit lay where he had been kneeling, skirts spread behind, body fallen together in folds, sleeves spread like wings on either side, bent at the elbow as though the arms that had left them had still ended in hands pressed together in prayer. Look, whispered Brother Richard in awe. All his clothes are here, one within another, as he would wear them, as though he had been lifted out of them and left them lying. This is most marvellous, said Prior Robert. How shall we understand it and not sin? Father, may we take up these garments, if there is trace or mark on them? There was none. Brother Cadfael was certain of that. Columbanus had not bled, his habit was not torn, nor even soiled. I do recall now, said the prior, shaken and chastened, and that was no harm, the prayer he made last night at Compline. How he cried out to be taken up living out of this world for pure ecstasy, if the Virgin Saint found him fit for such favour. Let us say a Mass here for Brother Columbanus, before we take up the Blessed Lady who has made him her herald, and go to make known this miracle of faith. He said Mass with absolute conviction, in the cloud of white flowers, the huddle of discarded garments at his feet. The people of Gwynedd, silent and observant, crowded in to fill the space available, made no sound, expressed no opinion. Their presence and silence passed for endorsement. What they really thought they kept to themselves. Now, said Prior Robert, moved almost to tears, let us take up this blessed burden, and praise God for the weight we carry. And he moved forward to offer his own delicate hands and frail shoulder, first of the devout. That was Brother Cadfael's worst moment, for it was the one thing that he had overlooked. Apart from Cadfael, the only monk of Shrewsbury who got a corner hoisted onto his neck was Jerome,
being of much the same height, and his was the sole voice that cried out in astonishment at the weight, and sagged under it until Gwynedd shifted nearer and hefted most of the load from him. "Your pardon, Father Prior, but who would have thought that those slender little bones could weigh so heavily?" Cadfael spoke up in hasty interpretation. "We are surrounded here by miracles, both small and great. Truly did Father Prior say that we thank God for the weight we carry. Is not this evidence of singular grace, that heaven has caused the weight of her worthiness to be so signally demonstrated?" In his present state, at once humbled and exalted, Prior Robert apparently did not find the logic of this nearly as peculiar as did Brother Cadfael himself. He would have accepted and embraced anything that added to his own triumph. So it was, on sturdy Gwytherin shoulders, that the reliquary and its contents were hoisted out of the chapel and borne in procession down to the parsonage. It was Gwytherin men who fetched the horses and mules and rigged a little cart, spread with cloths, on which the precious casket could be drawn home. The cortege set forth ceremoniously, half of Gwytherin there to watch it go, and sigh immense relief when it was gone. Father Hugh blessed the departing guests. Brother Cadfael settled himself well down in the saddle, and shook his bridle to let the mule know it might conduct him where it would. Very gently he dozed. It could not yet be called sleep. He was aware of the shifting light and the shadow under the trees, and the fresh, cool air and movement under him, and a sense of something completed, or almost completed, for this was only the first stage of the way home. He roused when they came to the high ridge above the river valley. There was no team ploughing down there now. All the ploughing, even the breaking of new ground, was done. He turned his head towards the wooded uplands on his right, and waited for the opening vista between the trees. It was brief and narrow, a sweep of grass soaring to a gentle crest beyond which the trees loomed close and dark. There were a number of people clustered there on the rounded hillock, most of Shonnett's household, far enough removed to be nameless to anyone who knew them less well than he. A cloud of dark hair beside a cap of flaxen, Kai's flaunting bandage shoved back like a hat unseated in a hot noon, a light brown head clasped close against a red thorn hedge that looked very like Brother John's abandoned tonsure. They were all waving and smiling, and Cadfael returned the salute with enthusiasm. Then the ambulant procession crossed the narrow opening, and the woods took all away. Brother Cadfael, well content, subsided into his saddle comfortably, and fell asleep.